The divorce papers had barely been signed before Adrian Blackwood started rewriting history. At the firm's annual gala, standing in front of 200 people with a glass of scotch in his hand, he told them all that the marriage had been a mutual decision, that they'd simply grown apart, that Claire had wanted different things. He said it so smoothly, so cleanly, that even the people who knew better began to doubt what they'd seen. Claire Bennett heard about it 3 days later from a former colleague. She didn't cry. She just sat with it. The way you sit with something that confirms what you already knew about a person. If this story already has you feeling something, drop a like. And tell me what city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let's get into it. The Blackwood Group's proposal for the Crescent Memorial expansion had been in the works for 11 months. 11 months of renderings, engineering assessments, zoning appeals, and contractor negotiations, all funneled through Adrian Blackwood's office on the 31st floor of a glass tower that looked out over the city like it owned it. Which, in a few meaningful ways, it did. The Blackwood Group had built or renovated nearly a third of the commercial real estate in the metropolitan area over the past decade. Hospitals, civic centers, mixed-use developments that turned forgotten industrial corridors into something the city could be photographed in front of. Adrian had a particular talent for knowing what a space could become before anyone else could see it. He was good at that, seeing potential in buildings. People were a different matter. He arrived at Crescent Memorial on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the trees along the hospital's main drive had mostly surrendered their leaves. He came in a black sedan, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most of the nursing staff earned in a month, with a leather folio under one arm and his project manager, Dennis Cho, half a step behind him. "Tour starts at 9, Dennis said, not looking up from his tablet. "Doctor, Hargrove is meeting us in the main lobby. Then the administrative wing, then the existing East Pavilion, and then the neonatal unit before lunch. What time's the site walkthrough?" 2 o'clock. Structural team's already on site. Adrian nodded once. He had the schedule memorized. He always did. It was a habit from the early years when he'd been the one taking notes instead of the one receiving reports. And the habit had stayed long after the necessity of it was gone. The lobby smelled like every hospital he'd ever walked through. Antiseptic layered over something floral, as if someone had decided that putting lilies on the reception desk would make people forget they were scared. The receptionist gave him the kind of politely cautious smile that hospital staff reserve for men who arrive in expensive suits and walk like they're about to tell someone something. Doctor. Hargrove was waiting by the elevator bank, a compact woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and a direct handshake. "Mr. Blackwood." She didn't gush. He appreciated that. "We're glad to have you here. The expansion will change what we're able to offer this community. Significantly." "That's the plan," Adrian said. "Let's make sure the plan holds up once we've seen the reality." She led them through the administrative corridors first, then into the existing East Wing, narrating the hospital's current limitations with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this argument many times, to donors, to board members, to city officials, and was not going to let the weight of repetition make her sound tired. She wasn't tired, she was precise. Adrian asked questions that made Dennis's pen move faster. He wanted to know about patient flow through the East Corridor, about whether the service elevators could handle the construction access, about what the hospital intended to do with the current supply storage in the area slated for demolition. He was present in the way he was always present, engaged, focused, impossible to read. They reached the neonatal unit at 9:47 Chatwood. The unit was accessed through a set of heavy double doors with a keypad entry and a small window reinforced with wire mesh. Dr. Hargrove paused to badge them in and turned to address Adrian and Dennis as the lock disengaged. "I want to prepare you," she said. "This unit is our most emotionally demanding. The staff here are extraordinary, but the circumstances they work in are difficult by definition. If at any point during the tour you have questions about how the space is used, please ask rather than assume." "Of course," Dennis said. Adrian didn't say anything. He was looking through the wire mesh window at the corridor beyond, at the pale blue walls and the soft overhead lighting calibrated to something gentler than the fluorescent harshness of the rest of the hospital, and something in his chest went quiet in a way he didn't have a name for. He told himself it was just a room. They went in. The neonatal unit smelled different from the rest of the hospital, warmer somehow. There was a low, constant hum of machinery, the monitors and incubators maintaining their careful vigils, but underneath it, something almost muffled, as if the space had its own particular stillness. The nurses moved quietly. There were 6 incubators visible from the corridor, most occupied, and the staff navigated between them with a particular kind of practiced tenderness, the kind you only develop after you've done something thousands of times, and it still matters to you. Dr. Hargrove was explaining the ventilation requirements for the expansion when Adrian stopped walking. He didn't mean to. His feet just stopped. At the far end of the corridor, through the glass wall of the care room, a woman was sitting in a rocking chair beside one of the incubators. She was leaning forward slightly, her elbows on her knees, her hands folded together in front of her mouth like she was thinking hard about something, or trying not to say something out loud. She was wearing a light blue hospital volunteer's lanyard. Her dark hair was pulled back the way she always pulled it back. Not neatly, just efficiently. The way you do it when appearance is genuinely the last thing on your mind. Adrian Blackwood had not seen Claire Bennett in 2 years, 3 months, and some recess of his brain supplied, unbidden, 16 days. "Mr. Blackwood?" Dennis's voice. "Sorry," Adrian said. He didn't move. "Give me a second." He couldn't have said what exactly happened inside him in that moment. He'd spent a significant portion of the last 2 years constructing a particular version of the marriage's ending. Clean, mutual, inevitable. The kind of story that holds up at galas. He'd told it enough times that it had taken on a kind of weight. Standing on the other side of a glass wall, watching Claire lean forward in a rocking chair and look at a baby with an expression he recognized, an expression he hadn't seen on her face since before everything fell apart. The story didn't hold up anymore. It didn't hold up at all. Dr. Hargrove noticed where he was looking. "That's Claire Bennett. She's one of our consistent volunteers. She's been with the unit for over a year. Remarkable dedication." He stopped. "What is she doing specifically?" "That infant," Dr. Hargrove said carefully, "was abandoned at this hospital approximately 6 weeks ago. No identification, no family came forward. He's been a patient here since birth. Claire has spent a great deal of time with him. She's actually in the process of applying to adopt him." The word hit somewhere Adrian hadn't expected. Adopt. He didn't go in immediately. He stood there for a moment longer, watching through the glass with Dennis checking something on his tablet and pretending not to notice that his boss had stopped breathing normally. Then Claire looked up. She saw him through the glass. He saw her see him. There was a fraction of a second where her face was completely open. Surprise, something complicated behind it. And then it closed again, the way a door closes when someone leans on it from the other side. She looked back at the baby. Adrian exhaled. "Let's continue the tour," he said. They completed the neonatal walkthrough. Adrian asked the right questions. He took in the space with the same professional focus he'd maintained for 11 months. He let Dr. Hargrove explain the proposed expansion footprint and why the current neonatal unit needed to be reconfigured rather than simply extended. He absorbed all of it. He just also couldn't stop knowing that Claire was 40 feet away behind a glass wall. At 10:30, Doctor. Hargrove excused herself for a brief administrative call and left them in the corridor with a junior staff member who was going to escort them to the cafeteria for coffee before the construction team arrived. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Claire walked out. She had Ethan's chart in her hand. Adrian didn't know his name yet, that would come later. And she was moving with the slightly distracted purposefulness of someone who has a task and doesn't intend to be interrupted from it. She stopped when she saw him properly. "Adrian." Her voice was exactly the same. He'd been bracing for it to be different. "Claire." He nodded once, which he immediately recognized as an absurd way to greet a woman you were married to for 6 years. "I didn't know you were... Dr. Hargrove mentioned you volunteer here." "I do," she said. She wasn't hostile. She also wasn't warm. She was doing that thing she'd always done when she was managing herself carefully, keeping her face neutral while her eyes did the actual work of figuring out what she was dealing with. "You look..." He stopped himself. He'd been about to say good. And that felt wrong. Not inaccurate, but wrong. like the word didn't fit the gap between who they'd been to each other and who they were now. "I look like someone who was in the middle of something," she said, a small, dry lift at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. "Right, sorry." He gestured vaguely at the corridor behind him. "We're here about the expansion, the East Pavilion." "I know, Dr. Hargrove mentioned it." She glanced at Dennis, who was suddenly very interested in his tablet. "It'll be good for the unit. They need the space." "That's what we're trying to build." A pause. The junior staff member was standing slightly too far away, studying the floor. "You look well, Adrian," Claire said. She said it like she was closing something. "Claire, I should get back." She held up the chart. "Not as an excuse, just as a fact. He had a rough night, and I want to talk to the attending before she goes off shift." "The baby," Adrian said. "The one in there. He was abandoned?" Something shifted in her face. Not pain exactly, but something in that neighborhood. 6 weeks ago. Left at the ER entrance. Nobody came. And you're trying to adopt him." She looked at him for a moment in a way that was very still. "Yes. That's..." He didn't have the end of the sentence ready. He hadn't thought he'd need it. "That's a significant decision." "It is," she agreed, and then quietly, "I'm not in the habit of making small ones anymore." She held his gaze for just a beat longer than was comfortable for either of them, and then she walked past him down the corridor, and the door swung closed behind her. Adrian stood in the corridor for what was probably 3 seconds, but felt longer. "Coffee?" Dennis said carefully. "Yeah," Adrian said. "Let's do that." He did not think about Claire during the afternoon walkthrough. He thought about load-bearing walls, soil compaction reports, the question of whether the East Access Road could handle the construction vehicle traffic without requiring a separate reinforcement contract. He thought about the timeline and whether the phased approach was going to satisfy the hospital board's desire to keep disruption to a minimum. He was very thorough and very focused, and he did not think about Claire at all. He thought about her in the car on the way back to the office. He thought about the expression on her face when she'd been sitting in that rocking chair. The particular quality of that expression, not happiness, not sadness, but something that looked like a decision. The kind of face someone makes when they've chosen something fully. He thought about the last year of their marriage, about the fertility specialist's office, the recycled air and the beige upholstered chairs, and Claire's hand in his, gripping harder than she probably realized, about the test results that came back wrong, and then wrong again, and then the third opinion that confirmed what the first two had said, about how he'd gone very quiet in those appointments, the way he went quiet when a building project hit a structural complication, retreating into calculation, into problem solving, because that was where he lived, where he was safe. And Claire had needed something else. She had needed him to not be calculating. He'd tried. He hadn't tried hard enough. He'd told himself at the time that he was trying, that his version of trying was valid, that not everyone grieved the same way. All of that was probably even technically true. It hadn't changed what happened. He remembered the afternoon she'd raised adoption, carefully, hesitantly, with the particular tone she used when she'd been thinking about something for a long time and was finally saying it out loud. She'd mentioned a colleague whose nephew had been in the foster system. She'd been reading things. She'd brought it up gently, like a question. He remembered what he'd said. He didn't want to, but he did. "That's not what I want. I want our family. Our own." He'd said it like it was a reasonable statement, like it wasn't exactly as cruel as it turned out to be. Claire had gone quiet in a different way after that, the particular quiet of someone who has just discovered something they needed to know. The Blackwood Group's offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building Adrian's father had developed in the 1980s, and Adrian had renovated completely in 2019. When he walked back in at 5:15, his assistant Maria handed him the afternoon's messages and told him Dennis had already sent over the preliminary site notes from the Crescent walkthrough. "How was the hospital?" Maria asked, because she'd worked for him for 7 years and had earned the right to ask things like that. "Informative," Adrian said. She looked at him in the way she did sometimes, the way that meant she was filing something away for later. "Your mother called. She wants to know if you're coming to dinner Sunday." "I'll call her." He went into his office and closed the door and sat down at his desk without turning on the desk lamp. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was doing what cities do at dusk. All those lit windows coming on, all those separate lives arranged in their separate squares of light. He thought about a baby with no name on file, left at an emergency entrance 6 weeks ago. Nobody came. He thought about Claire in a rocking chair, hands folded, face doing the thing it did when she had decided. He sat there for a while. Then he turned on the lamp and started reading Dennis's site notes, because that was what he did. He worked. He moved forward. He built things. It was the only thing he'd ever been truly confident he was good at. He went back to Crescent Memorial the following Thursday. It was a legitimate visit. He needed to walk the East Wing Foundation access with the structural engineer and discuss the drainage management for the construction phase. There was nothing unusual about being there. He went 3 times in the first 2 weeks. He told himself the second and third visits were also legitimate. On the second visit, he didn't see Claire at all. On the third, he caught a glimpse of her through the neonatal unit glass. She was standing, this time, holding the baby the way you hold a baby when you know how. Securely. Not stiffly, the way people hold infants when they're nervous about it. She had him against her shoulder and one hand spread across his back, and she was talking to one of the nurses, gesturing with her free hand, and she looked— it took him a moment to find the right word. She looked like herself, like the version of herself he'd met at the beginning, before everything got complicated and painful and before he'd made the specific choices that made it worse. She had that quality again, the directness, the focus, the sense that she knew exactly what mattered to her. He'd fallen in love with that quality. He'd then systematically failed to protect it. On his 4th visit, Dr. Hargrove mentioned, apparently in passing, that Claire's adoption home study had been completed and that the paperwork was now moving through the County Family Services Office. "She's a remarkable advocate," Dr. Hargrove said. They were standing in the administrative wing, reviewing a blueprint revision. "For Ethan, and for all the children in the unit. She's changed the culture here, honestly. Volunteers come and go, but she stayed, even in the hard weeks." "Ethan," Adrian repeated. "That's his name?" The staff named him. Claire suggested it. Dr. Hargrove said it simply, without elaboration, and went back to the blueprint. Ethan. Adrian looked at the blueprint. He noted the dimensions of the proposed expansion corridor. He made a comment about the width of the access points for medical equipment. He filed the name away and didn't look at it again until he was in the elevator going down. Baset. He saw her properly on the 4th visit, not through glass, not briefly in a corridor, but actually standing in the same room. There was a small family meeting space near the neonatal unit used for conferences between staff, families, and social workers. The door was open. Claire was at the table with a woman Adrian didn't recognize, mid-40s, carrying a file folder with the county seal on it, and they were talking in the unhurried way of people who have serious paperwork between them. He shouldn't have stopped. He stopped. Claire glanced up and saw him in the doorway. "You're here again," she said. It wasn't accusatory, just an observation. "Foundation walkthrough," he said. "The drainage study came back with a complication. It always does." A small pause. The woman with the folder was looking at him with polite professional blankness. "Adrian, this is Sandra Okafor, County Family Services." She didn't add "Adrian is my ex-husband" out loud, but the slight shift in her posture communicated the relevant context. Sandra nodded. "Mr. Blackwood, the hospital expansion is a good thing for this community." "We're hoping so." He looked at the folder. He looked at Claire. "I'll let you get back to it." "Thank you," Claire said. Same tone as before. Careful. Not closed, but not open. He left the doorway and walked to the elevator and stood there waiting for it, and thought, she is in there fighting through county paperwork for a child no one else came for. And then he thought, she offered me this once, and I told her it wasn't what I wanted. The elevator came. He got in it. He looked at his reflection in the brushed steel doors, the suit, the folio, the whole presentation of himself. And he thought that he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been very successful at everything except the things that mattered in rooms like this one. That night, he called his mother. Margaret Blackwood was 71 years old and had the kind of social intelligence that she'd spent her whole life pretending was just politeness. She'd never particularly liked the way Adrian's marriage had ended, not because she'd been especially close to Claire, but because she had a fine-tuned sense for when her son was performing a version of himself rather than being one. "You're calling because something happened," she said, approximately 40 seconds into the conversation. "I'm calling because I said I would," Adrian said. "You're calling because you want to talk about something, but you're going to not talk about it directly for about 15 minutes first. We can skip that part if you want." He exhaled. "I saw Claire today." Silence on the other end. Not surprised silence. More like careful silence. "Where?" she asked. "The hospital. I'm doing the expansion project. She volunteers there." "I see. She's trying to adopt a child, an infant who was abandoned at the hospital." Another pause. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel like—" He stopped. Started again. "I told her no. When she brought it up, adoption. I told her that wasn't the family I wanted." "I know what you told her," his mother said quietly. "I was wrong. She didn't say yes, you were, and she didn't say these things are complicated. She just waited. I built my entire position on the idea that bloodline mattered," he said. "Legacy, inheritance, the Blackwood name meaning something, and now she's in there, every day. Apparently she's in there. And she found a child no one claimed, and she's claiming him. She's building something real." "And you're building a parking structure," his mother said. "An expansion pavilion." "Adrian, I know," he said. "I know what you mean." They were quiet for a moment. "Come to dinner Sunday," Margaret said finally. "I want to talk to you about something, in person." "About what?" "Sunday," she said. "It'll keep." He didn't see Claire again that week. He worked. He reviewed proposals. He approved contract revisions for the Crescent project and had 3 meetings about an unrelated development on the east side and a lunch with a city councilman who wanted to talk about affordable housing incentives. He was busy. He was always busy. The busyness had been, for 2 years, a structure he'd built around himself the way you build a wall. Not to keep things out, exactly, but to give yourself something to push against when the other pressures came. He kept thinking about Claire's face in the rocking chair, about Ethan, 6 weeks old approximately, abandoned at an ER entrance, named by the people who stayed, about the word his mother had used, claiming. She found a child no one claimed, and she's claiming him. Adrian Blackwood had spent 15 years building things. He was very good at knowing what a structure needed to last. He could look at a foundation and tell you exactly where the weak points were. He just hadn't been as good at looking at himself. He thought about that for several days, not comfortably. On the Friday of the second week, he arrived at the hospital early. The structural meeting wasn't until 10, but he came at 8 and walked the east wing alone, the way he liked to walk a site before the full team arrived. Just him and the space, getting a sense of it. He ended up, without quite deciding to, outside the neonatal unit. Through the glass, Claire was there. Claire. It was early, before 8:30, and she was there already, in the same rocking chair, Ethan against her chest now, not in the incubator. The baby was clearly awake. His small arms moved in the unfocused way newborns move, like they're discovering that their hands belong to them. Claire was talking to him. Adrian couldn't hear through the glass, but he could see her mouth moving, low, unhurried, private. And he could see Ethan's face turn toward the sound of her voice, the way small things turn toward warmth. He stood there longer than he intended. He thought about the word family and how he'd spent so long defining it as something that came from blood and shared genetics and the continuation of a name. He thought about how certain he'd been, how clean it had seemed, that certainty, how much easier it was than the alternative. The alternative was standing on the other side of a glass wall, watching a woman love a child who had nothing in common with her except the decision she had made. He thought, she's already his mother. He thought, and I spent 6 years married to her and didn't know she had this in her. That wasn't right, and he knew it as soon as he thought it. He had known. She had told him, gently, carefully, in a beige office with upholstered chairs. She had said, there are other ways to build a family. She had said it like a door opening, and he had closed it. He was still standing there when Claire looked up and saw him through the glass. This time she didn't close her face. She looked at him for a long moment, holding Ethan, early morning, no armor on. And the expression she had was impossible to categorize. Not anger, not invitation, something in between that had its own weight. She looked down at Ethan, then back up at Adrian. Then she turned very deliberately back to the baby, and she kept talking to him in whatever quiet words she'd been saying, and she didn't look up again. Adrian stood there for another moment. Then he went to find a coffee machine and wait for his structural engineer. He had work to do. He also had things to sit with that he was only beginning to understand the shape of. Sunday dinner at Margaret Blackwood's house was a ritual that had survived everything. The years when Adrian was building the company and could barely find time to eat, the marriage, the divorce, the particular silence that had settled over the family during the worst of it. The house itself was part of the ritual. A wide colonial on a quiet street in the older part of the city, the kind of neighborhood that had been elegant once and had simply stayed that way through sheer stubbornness. Margaret had lived there for 40 years. She'd raised Adrian in it. She kept it the way she kept most things, maintained, deliberate, not sentimental about it, but not willing to let it go either. Adrian arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine he'd picked up from the shop 2 blocks from his building. He didn't cook and he rarely brought food, but he always brought wine because it was something concrete to do with his hands when he walked through that door. Margaret was in the kitchen when he came in, which meant she was finishing something, which meant dinner was close. He set the wine on the counter, and she handed him the corkscrew without turning around from the stove. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine." "You look tired, and you're going to tell me you're fine for about 10 minutes before you say what you actually came to say." She turned around. She was a small woman who had always seemed larger than her actual dimensions, and she looked at her son with the focused attention of someone who had been reading him for 51 years and was no longer fooled by the cover. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen island, which was where they always ended up during the important conversations, as opposed to the dining room, which was for the manageable ones. "I keep going back," he said. He hadn't planned to start there. "To the hospital." She stirred something on the stove. "How many times?" 4, 5, counting today." A pause. "The last 2 were only partly about the project." "Only partly." "The drainage study is legitimate," he said, hearing himself, stopping. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like a man using work as an excuse to be near someone he's not sure how to approach directly." She said it without judgment, just precision. "Which is a very old habit of yours. I'm not trying to approach her. It's not about getting her back. That's not—" He stopped again because he wasn't sure what it was about exactly, and saying things he wasn't sure of in front of his mother had never served him well. Margaret brought 2 glasses to the island and sat down across from him. "Tell me what you see when you go." He thought about it. He thought about the rocking chair, about Ethan's arms moving in the early morning light, about Claire's mouth forming words through glass that he couldn't hear. "She found something," he said finally. "Something she was always supposed to have, and I was in the way of it." Margaret was quiet. "Not on purpose," he said, "or not entirely on purpose. But when she brought up adoption, He turned the wine glass in his hands. "You know what I said." "I know. It was cruel." "It was scared," his mother said. "Scared things are often cruel. That doesn't make them less cruel, but it's useful to know the difference." He looked at her. "Is there a difference from her end?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She picked up her own glass and held it without drinking and looked at the middle distance in the way she did when she was deciding something. Not calculating. Deciding. There was a difference. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I've been sitting on this for a while. I was going to tell you eventually. She exhaled. "I wanted you to be ready to hear it properly." "Tell me what?" She put her glass down. She looked at him directly, which was how she delivered things that mattered. "Your father and I tried for 4 years before you were born. We had a doctor tell us it was unlikely, and then—" She stopped, started again. "You were not born to me, Adrian. Not biologically." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm adopted," he said. He heard the words come out of his mouth, and they didn't feel real, the way words sometimes don't feel real when they're describing something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. "We were going to tell you when you were older," Margaret said. And then older kept shifting. And then your father got sick, and it didn't feel right without him. And then her voice caught, just briefly. She steadied it. Then you got married and started trying for a family, and I watched you go through all of it, Adrian, and I kept thinking, tell him, but I was afraid of what it would mean, what you'd think of us, what you'd think of yourself. Who? He stopped. Where did I? A woman named Patricia Marsh. She was 22. She wasn't in a position to raise a child, and she chose an agency that matched her with us. Margaret reached across the island and put her hand over his, firmly, the way she'd held his hand when he was small and certain things were frightening. You were 3 weeks old when we brought you home. I have never, not once in 51 years, thought of you as anything other than my son. But you need to know. He sat with it. He sat with it for what felt like a long time, but was probably under a minute. And then, slowly, like something large shifting in a space that was too small to contain it, he began to understand what it meant. He drove home after dinner on autopilot, the city moving past the car windows in its usual indifferent way. He sat in the parking garage of his building for 12 minutes before going up. He knew this because he looked at his phone before getting out of the car, and the timestamp was there, a fact, something concrete in an evening that had suddenly become very abstract. He was adopted. He had spent 6 years in a marriage doing damage, real, lasting damage, over the idea that his bloodline mattered, that his name needed to continue through biology, that there was something diminished about building a family any other way. He had looked at his wife and told her that what she was offering wasn't what he wanted, and the entire premise of that refusal was a story he'd been living inside without knowing it wasn't true. He went upstairs. He didn't turn on the television. He sat on the couch in his living room with the lights on and thought about this for a long time. He thought about the man he'd been at the beginning of the marriage. Hungry, driven, already building the company into something serious with a very clear idea of what the future was supposed to look like. He'd wanted kids early. He talked about it with Claire in the easy, confident way that people talk about things they assume will happen. He hadn't thought of it as something fragile. He'd thought of it as the next thing on a list that had, up to that point, mostly gone the way he'd planned. Then the next thing didn't happen. And didn't happen. And didn't happen again. And Adrian had done what he did with structural complications, retreated into the problem, into the management of it, into the appointments and the terminology and the second opinions, and somewhere in the retreat he'd left Claire alone in the middle of something that needed both of them. She had told him that once, not loudly. Claire rarely did anything loudly. She'd told him on a Sunday morning, sitting in the kitchen that had been their kitchen, with coffee going cold between them. I need you to be here, Adrian, not managing it, just here. He'd said he was here. He was right there. She'd looked at him with something tired in her eyes and said, You're in the room. That's different. He hadn't understood what she meant, or he'd understood and decided she was wrong, which was the same as not understanding and considerably worse. He went to the hospital on Monday. The structural meeting was real this time. There was an actual complication with the proposed placement of a load-bearing element in the east wing, and the engineer wanted to walk it with him before they brought the revised plans to the hospital board. Adrian was there for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and was focused and useful and resolved the complication in a way that satisfied everyone. He did not go to the neonatal unit. He told himself this was because there was no reason to. The project didn't take him there. He had the information he needed from the previous walkthroughs. He also thought about Claire, intermittently, for the entire 2 hours and 40 minutes. On Tuesday, he had Maria pull the public record on the neonatal expansion programs at comparable facilities in other cities. He told her it was for a proposal addendum he was considering. This was true. It was also not the only reason. He read through the case studies from 3 comparable hospitals: Indianapolis, Charlotte, a smaller facility in Boise that had overhauled their vulnerable infant program, and thought about Ethan, about the 6 weeks, about the fact that somewhere in the administrative machinery of County Family Services, a stack of paperwork was moving slowly toward something that would determine where that child's life went. He thought about the recommendation letter, Doctor. Hargrove had mentioned, offhandedly, in a hallway conversation he hadn't been supposed to overhear. She'd been talking to a social worker about Claire's application. She'd said, The more credible community voices we can get speaking to her capacity and character, the better. He'd kept walking. He'd noted it the way he noted most things. He sat with that note now. He saw Claire again on Thursday. He'd been walking through the East Corridor with Dennis and the project architect, discussing the timeline for the first phase of demolition, when he nearly walked into her. She was coming from the direction of the staff lounge carrying a cup of coffee and a manila envelope, and she pulled up short when she saw the group coming toward her. "Sorry," she said, stepping to the side. Then she registered who it was. "Adrian." "We keep doing this," he said. "The hallways are only so wide." She glanced at Dennis and the architect with the same careful neutrality she always deployed when there were other people present, which he'd always found mildly maddening and now found somewhat clarifying. She was protecting something, herself, obviously, but also the conversation, keeping it at a distance from witnesses. "Can I—" He stopped, looked at Dennis. "Give me 5 minutes." Dennis nodded with the practiced blankness of a man who had learned not to visibly react to his boss's emotional life. He and the architect walked ahead and found something to look at on a clipboard. Adrian turned back to Claire, who was watching him with an expression that was calibrated, held, not giving him anything for free. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "All right. The adoption process. Where is it right now?" Something moved through her face, too quick to name, gone before he could read it. "Why?" I'm asking because I'm asking, not because I'm planning anything, not because I'm—" He made himself stop constructing the sentence. "I just want to know how it's going." She looked at him for a moment, a considering look, the kind that meant she was deciding whether the question deserved an answer. "Home study's done," she said. "Social worker's report came back positive. The county is reviewing the formal application. There's a hearing in approximately 3 weeks. Is there anything that could complicate it?" "Plenty of things," she said flatly. "It's family services. Complications are the default. But specifically, in your case." "Adrian, I'm not trying to interfere. He exhaled. "I'm asking because I was wrong. About adoption. About what I said when you brought it up. I know that doesn't undo anything. I know it's 2 years too late to be useful to you in the way it should have been. But I want you to know I understand that now." Claire looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he was aware of the corridor around them. The sound of a cart rolling somewhere nearby. A PA announcement. The ordinary machinery of a hospital doing its work. "You saw him through the glass," she said. "Ethan." "Yes." "And it made you think about us." "Yes." She nodded slowly. Not agreeing exactly. Processing. "Adrian, I'm not interested in relitigating the marriage. I'm not looking for an apology. I moved past needing one." She said it without heat, which made it more definitive. "What I'm interested in is making sure Ethan is okay. That's what takes up the space now." "I know." "So if you're asking where the adoption stands because you want to feel better about something, that's fine. You can feel better about it. But it doesn't change the trajectory of anything." "I know that too." She tilted her head slightly. "Then what do you want?" He didn't answer immediately. He answered honestly, which was harder. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm still figuring out what kind of man I want to be on the other side of realizing I was wrong about something significant. I don't have a clean answer for that." That landed differently than the rest of it. He could see it in the small shift at the corner of her mouth. Not quite softening, but something adjacent. "That's a more honest thing than you usually say," she said. "I'm working on it." She looked at him for another moment. Then she shifted the envelope under her arm and her coffee to her other hand. "The county hearing is in 3 weeks. After that, if everything goes the way the social worker thinks it should, the adoption could be finalized within 60 days. "That's good," he said. Claire, that's really good." Something crossed her face that he didn't try to name. She nodded. "Go catch up with your architect," she said. "The East Wing isn't going to fix itself." She walked past him, and he watched her go, and he thought, "She is so much further down the road than I am. She has already done the work I'm just starting to understand I need to do." It was humbling in a way that nothing in his professional life had ever managed to be. He started paying closer attention after that. Not following her, nothing like that. But when he was on site and their paths crossed, he stopped treating those moments as things to be managed and started treating them as information. He paid attention to how she moved through the neonatal unit, how the nurses talked to her, not with the politeness you give a volunteer, but with the ease of colleagues. How she knew the names of all the babies in the unit, not just Ethan. How she could read a monitor and knew what the numbers meant. He found himself in a conversation with one of the senior nurses, a woman named Patrice, during a coffee break one morning. He'd asked an innocuous question about the neonatal unit's current capacity constraints, framing it as project research. Patrice had answered efficiently, and then, because she was perceptive in the way long-tenured nurses tend to be, had added, "You know Claire, don't you? It's not a secret. The way you look at her when you think nobody's noticing." Adrian set his coffee cup down. "Is it obvious?" "To me it is," Patrice said. "To her, I don't know. She doesn't look back much." "That's fair," he said. "She's been through a lot to get here," Patrice said. "Not hostile, not protective, just factual." After her marriage ended, it was not a good time for her. For a while, she was just doing what people do when they're getting from one day to the next. Then she found the unit, found Ethan. She paused. You watch somebody find their footing again after they've lost it. You get protective. I understand. Do you? He thought about the question seriously instead of deflecting it. I'm starting to. Patrice looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone reserving judgment. Then she picked up her own coffee and said, "The drainage thing you mentioned to Hargrove last week, the East Access Road. We had a supply truck tear up the pavement there 2 winters ago. You should account for that in your repair estimate." "I'll note it," he said. She nodded and walked away, and he sat there with his coffee thinking about what she'd said. After her marriage ended, it was not a good time for her. He knew this, in abstract. He had known, in the way you know things you are trying not to look at directly, that the divorce had cost Claire something significant. She had given 6 years and a very specific future to something that fell apart. She had gone through fertility treatments that took a physical and emotional toll he'd been present for, but hadn't been fully in for. She had offered him a way forward and been told no. He had framed the end of the marriage as mutual, had built an entire social narrative around the word mutual, and standing in a hospital cafeteria listening to a nurse describe the fallout, he thought that might have been the last cruelty in a sequence of smaller ones. Not the divorce itself. The story he'd told about it afterward. We simply grew apart, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't tried. Bummed. He had lunch alone on a bench outside the hospital's east entrance that afternoon, which was an unusual thing for him to do. He typically worked through lunch at his desk or in a meeting, but the day was mild for October and the site was in a holding pattern while the revised plans went back to the structural team, and he found himself sitting outside with a sandwich from the cafeteria, watching the city move past the hospital gates. He thought about his mother's face when she told him, the steadiness of it, the specific kind of courage it takes to deliver a truth you've been carrying for 50 years. He thought about Patricia Marsh, 22 years old, making a decision he would never fully understand the weight of. Choosing an agency, trusting that the people on the other end would give her child something she couldn't. He thought about himself at 3 weeks old, which was approximately how old Ethan was right now. Unknown, unnamed, entirely dependent on the choice of an adult to show up. Someone had shown up for him. Margaret and Edward Blackwood had shown up with whatever imperfect mixture of readiness and love and fear most new parents carry in, and they had raised him, and he had grown up knowing exactly who he was and exactly where he came from, and he had built an entire identity on a foundation that was real, but not the foundation he'd thought it was. Ethan was waiting for Claire to show up in the legal sense. She was already there in every sense that mattered. She was waiting for the paperwork to catch up to the reality. He finished his sandwich and sat for a while longer in the mild autumn air and thought about what he could do that would actually be useful. Not useful to himself. Useful to her. To Ethan. The distinction felt important. He was becoming aware that most of what he'd done for most of his adult life had been useful to himself while wearing the costume of being useful to something larger. The company. The legacy. The name. It was an uncomfortable thing to see clearly. He called Dennis at 3 o'clock. "I want to expand the proposal," he said. "The Crescent Project. I want to add a component. What kind of component? Dennis sounded cautious. He'd learned to be cautious when Adrian called in the afternoon with new ideas, because new ideas in the afternoon usually meant someone was working through something that had nothing to do with square footage. A dedicated facility within the expansion, Adrian said, specifically designed for abandoned and at-risk infants. Not just a general neonatal expansion, a purpose-built space, better staffing ratios, a family integration program, housing support resources for prospective adoptive parents who are going through the process while the child is still inpatient. Silence on the other end for a moment. That's a significant scope increase, Dennis said. I know. The budget? I'll cover the gap personally if the hospital board won't fund it. Run the numbers and come back to me. Another pause. Adrian, are you sure this is the right call? The board already approved the original proposal. Changing scope mid-planning is going to push the timeline. Then it pushes the timeline, Adrian said. Some things are worth taking longer. Dennis was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking. He decided to say it. This isn't just about the project, is it? It's entirely about the project, Adrian said, and also it isn't. Both things are true. He could hear Dennis exhale at the other end of the line. I'll run the numbers, but I want it on record that I mentioned the timeline. Noted. It's on record. He hung up and sat back in his chair and looked at the preliminary schematics for the expansion laid out across his desk. The east wing, the proposed new pavilion, the corridors connecting old and new. Buildings were, when you stripped everything else away, just organized space. Space made useful by what you put in it, what you decided it was for. He picked up a pencil and started making notes in the margins, the way he had at the very beginning, when he was still the person writing things down instead of the person things were written down for. He saw Claire twice in the following week, both times briefly, both times in passing, and both times she was in motion, carrying something, heading somewhere, in the middle of something. She acknowledged him each time with a nod that was warmer than the first week's nods, which was a minor calibration he noticed and didn't make too much of. The second time, on a Wednesday afternoon, she was pushing an IV stand down the neonatal corridor, and she stopped when she saw him. You're here a lot, she said. Not accusatory anymore. More like an observation settling into fact. The project is at a complicated stage, he said. How complicated? I'm expanding the scope. She tilted her head. Dr. Hargrove didn't mention that. I'm presenting it to the board next week. It's not finalized yet. She studied him for a moment with that same considering look. What kind of expansion? He told her. Not the whole thing, not the financial commitment he was considering, not all of it, but the core of it. The purpose-built space, the family integration program, the support resources for prospective adoptive parents. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. That would change things, she said, for families in the process. The waiting is the hardest part. Being close, but not being recognized yet as a family. I know, he said. She looked at him. I'm beginning to understand that, he said. I wasn't trying to claim I know what you meant, she said quietly. She looked down at the IV stand and then back up at him. Ethan had a good week. He's been off the supplemental oxygen for 4 days. The shift was deliberate. He could see that. She was giving him something. Not much. Not an opening in the way people talked about openings. Just a piece of information about the thing that mattered most to her, offered to him like you hand something fragile to someone when you're deciding whether they know how to hold it. He took it the right way. He didn't make it into more than it was. That's a real milestone, he said, at this stage. It is. She allowed herself a small moment of visible pride, just a second's worth, enough to be real. He's tough. Stubborn, actually. The nurses keep saying he fights the routine. Sounds exhausting. Sounds like a personality, she said. And there was the small lift at the corner of her mouth that was the closest thing to a real smile she'd given him since they'd walked back into each other's lives. It was gone in a moment, but it had been there. She moved on down the corridor. He let her go. He stood there in the neonatal hallway with the monitors humming behind the glass, and the particular quiet of a space designed to sustain small lives. And he thought about what it meant to hold something fragile correctly. You didn't grip it. You didn't try to control the weight of it. You just held it, made space for it, paid attention. He was learning, slowly, imperfectly, but he was learning. What? On Friday, he went back to his office and sat down with a blank document on his screen and stayed with it for a while before he started typing. He had never written a character reference letter. He had written hundreds of business communications, proposals, contracts, formal letters to municipal boards and city councilmen. He knew how to construct a persuasive document. He knew how to make an argument that held up. But he sat with the blank page for a while before he started, because he wanted to be careful. He wanted to say something true, not something strategic. He wanted to write the kind of thing that would matter in the right way. Not the kind that impressed, but the kind that clarified. He thought about what he actually knew, not what he wished he'd known. What he knew. He knew Claire Bennett was the most consistently reliable person he had ever been close to. He knew she was direct in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable and always honest. He knew that when she committed to something, she didn't do it halfway. That the version of half commitment that most people would find acceptable was something she was constitutionally unable to perform. He knew that she had volunteered in the neonatal unit for over a year, in the hard weeks and the routine ones, for a child who had no legal claim on her and who she had no legal claim on yet. He knew the nurses treated her like a colleague. He knew she had named the baby and the name had stuck. He knew that Ethan, at 6 weeks old, turned toward the sound of her voice. He started writing. He wrote for a long time, longer than he expected to, revising sentences not to make them sound better, but to make them say exactly what he meant. When he was done, he read it twice. It wasn't polished. It didn't sound like a Blackwood Group document. It sounded like a person trying to tell the truth about another person as clearly as possible. He thought that was probably what it was supposed to sound like. He saved it. He didn't send it yet. He wanted to sit with it over the weekend to make sure it was right. Not right in the way he usually measured things, by how they performed, but right in the way that mattered here. Real, honest, useful to someone other than him. He closed his laptop and looked out at the city getting dark outside his window, and thought about small lives and what they needed, and about the particular kind of strength it took to be the person who showed up when no one else did. He was beginning to understand that strength. He was beginning to understand how far he was from it, and also that far was not the same as impossible. He sent the letter on Monday morning. He'd read it again over the weekend, twice on Saturday, and once more Sunday night, and each time he'd found something he wanted to change. A word that sounded too formal, a sentence that veered into the territory of performance rather than truth. He revised it each time, small adjustments, until on Sunday evening he read it through and felt that what was on the page was actually what he meant. Not what sounded good. What was true. He addressed it to Sandra Okafor at the County Family Services Office, with a copy noted for the hospital's patient advocacy coordinator, and he sent it from his personal email address, not the company account. That felt important. The company account had letterhead and legal footers and implied the weight of an institution behind every word. He didn't want institutional weight. He wanted the letter to be from him, specifically as a person who had known Claire Bennett and was prepared to say, on record, what that knowledge had shown him. He didn't tell Claire he'd sent it. He thought about telling her. He went back and forth on it for most of the weekend. Part of him wanted her to know, wanted the acknowledgement, the moment of her understanding what he'd done. He recognized that wanting, sat with it, and decided it was exactly the wrong reason to say anything. If he told her, it became about him, about his gesture, his growth, his need to be seen making a better choice than the ones he'd made before. The letter wasn't for him. So he sent it and said nothing, and went to the hospital on Monday for a meeting with the board's facilities committee about the expanded proposal. And he presented the scope additions with the same focused efficiency he brought to every proposal. And when the committee asked about the financial structure for the family integration program, he laid out the numbers clearly and said he was prepared to fund the gap personally if the hospital's endowment couldn't cover it. And the room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when someone puts money behind a conviction. Dr. Hargrove, sitting at the end of the conference table, looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not quite skeptical, not quite approving. Something in between. the look of a person who has seen a lot of initiatives launched with good intentions and is waiting to see whether this one has staying power. He understood the look. He wasn't offended by it. The family integration program, she said. What does that look like in practice? Concretely, a dedicated space adjacent to the neonatal unit where prospective adoptive parents can spend extended time with infants in their care. Not visiting hours. Actual sustained presence. Support resources for navigating the legal process while the child is still inpatient. A family advocate role, either staff or contracted, who can help bridge the gap between medical status and legal status. That's going to require additional staffing, said the committee chair, a man named Rollins who had the permanent expression of someone reviewing a budget. I know, I've budgeted for it. Rollins looked at the numbers, looked at Adrian. You've given this significant thought. I've been at this hospital for 5 weeks, Adrian said. I've seen what's in that unit, what the staff manage every day. I don't think the original proposal goes far enough. Another silence. Hargrove made a note. We'll take it to the full board, Rollins said finally. But I don't anticipate significant pushback on the expanded scope. The community need is documented. Adrian nodded and gathered his materials and thought that the meeting had gone about as well as it could have, and that the part that mattered most, the letter already sent, the expanded proposal on the table, was already out of his hands, which was where it needed to be. He was in the East Wing corridor that afternoon, walking the revised site plan with the project architect, when he heard the sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not alarms, nothing like that. Just a rapid change in the quality of noise coming from the neonatal unit. A quickness in the voices. The particular percussion of running feet on linoleum when someone is moving fast but trying not to move fast. The specific hospital compromise between urgency and panic. Adrian and the architect both stopped. Through the glass wall of the corridor that ran adjacent to the neonatal unit, he could see movement. Nurses converging on one of the incubator bays, a physician he'd seen before appearing from the far end of the unit with the concentrated energy of someone who has already been briefed on what they're walking into. He couldn't see Ethan's bay from where he was standing. He moved down the corridor without deciding to, until the angle through the glass changed, until he could see. It was Ethan's bay. The incubator was surrounded. The monitors above it showed the numbers going wrong in the specific way monitors show wrongness, the particular visual language of a crisis in progress. He could see the staff working, calm and fast, which was more frightening than panicked fast would have been, because it meant they'd been here before and knew exactly what to do, and they were doing all of it, which meant the situation required all of it. Claire was not in the room. And then she was. She came through the unit door from the family consultation corridor. She must have been in a meeting with someone. She still had papers in her hand. And she stopped when she saw the cluster at Ethan's bay, and the papers hit the floor, and she crossed the room in a way that Adrian had never seen her move, which was to say without any of her usual contained purposefulness, without the managed quality she normally carried, just straight toward him, toward that incubator, toward whatever was happening. One of the nurses intercepted her before she reached the bay, gently, firmly, the kind of interception that meant you can't be in there right now, not during this part. Adrian watched Claire stop, watched her hands, still empty now, the papers on the floor, come up and grab the nurse's arms. Not hysterical, but not steady either. "What's happening?" she said. He couldn't hear it through the glass, but he could read it perfectly. The nurse was talking to her, explaining. Claire's face went through something complicated and then settled into a kind of fierce stillness that was worse to watch than the moment before it, because it was the stillness of someone deciding to hold themselves together by force of will alone. She let go of the nurse's arms. She stepped back from the bay. She stood at the edge of the room with her hands pressed flat against the outside of the incubator row and watched. Adrian stood on the other side of the glass and watched her watch. The architect said something he didn't register. He said, "Give me a minute." He didn't wait for an answer. Bosham. He went to the corridor outside the neonatal unit door, and he stood there because there was nowhere else to go and nothing he could do that would be useful, and he understood that, but he couldn't make himself leave. The unit had a small family waiting area attached, 4 chairs, a low table with a box of tissues that had been there long enough to become part of the furniture, a window that looked out at the side of the adjacent parking structure. He sat in one of the chairs. He didn't know why. He just sat. He thought about the tiny body inside that incubator. 8, 9 weeks old now. Stubborn, Claire had said, fights the routine. He thought about what Patrice had told him, that Claire had been in the hard weeks and the routine ones, all of them, the whole time. He thought about what it meant to love something that fragile, to give yourself over to the project of protecting something that could be taken from you at any moment by a set of circumstances entirely outside your control. He thought, this is what she offered me once, this exact vulnerability, and I called it insufficient. He sat in the waiting area chair, and he was not comfortable, and he did not deserve to be. 40 minutes later, the unit door opened and Claire came out. She saw him immediately. He'd expected surprise, some version of why are you still here, but instead she just stopped and looked at him, and something in her face was so raw and unguarded that he stood up without thinking about it, the way you stand up when someone walks into a room carrying something heavy. He's stable, she said. Her voice was controlled, but the edges of it weren't. They got him stabilized. There was an infection, they think. It moved fast. They're running cultures. Okay, Adrian said. That's okay. Stable is good. Yes, she said, but she didn't sound convinced, or rather, she sounded like someone who knows the factual meaning of the word and is not yet in the part of her brain that processes facts. He said the only true thing he could think to say. I was out there watching through the glass. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed. She looked at him for a moment, not softening, not opening, just looking. And then she sat down in the chair next to the one he'd been in, which was not an invitation exactly, but was at minimum an acknowledgement that he was there. He sat back down. They were quiet for a while. The hospital moved around them, voices down the corridor, a door closing somewhere, the indifferent, ordinary sounds of a building full of people doing their jobs. He's been off oxygen for 6 days, she said. I thought we were past the really dangerous part. You might still be, Adrian said. Infections are treatable. They got it early. They don't know how early. No, he said. They don't yet. She appreciated that he didn't try to fix it with false certainty. He could see it in the small exhale she let out. Not relief, but something adjacent. The slight easing of a person who is tired of being managed by people who are uncomfortable with uncertainty. The hearing is in 11 days, she said. The adoption hearing. I know. She looked at him. How do you know? You told me, a couple weeks ago. Right. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs, a gesture he recognized. It was what she did when she was preventing herself from fidgeting, which was something she did only when she was frightened. He'd seen it in the fertility specialist's office. He hadn't known what it meant then. He knew now. If something happens before the hearing, if his medical situation changes in a way that makes the county think placement should be reconsidered, that's not what's going to happen, Adrian said. You don't know that. No, he said again. But the county's report is positive, and you've been his primary caregiver in practice for 2 months, and that's a documented real thing. An infection doesn't change that. If anything, it demonstrates... He stopped himself. She looked at him. Demonstrates what? He said it carefully. That you're the person who stays. She was quiet. When I saw you come through the door, he said, and you dropped the papers, and you went straight to him. That's not something you perform for a record. That's just what you do. Anyone watching can see it. Her jaw tightened briefly. Anyone watching, she said, and there was something in it, not quite bitterness, but the ghost of it. The acknowledgement of the long stretch of time when the right person hadn't been watching. Claire, don't, she said, not harshly. I can't do the conversation about us right now. Not today. I know. I'm sorry. He meant both things separately. She nodded. She turned back to looking at the door of the neonatal unit, as if she could see through it to the incubator bay on the other side. They sat together in the small waiting area for another 20 minutes. They didn't talk much. Adrian did not try to fill the silence, which was itself something he'd learned. That not all silences needed filling, that sometimes the presence was the point and the words were just something people did because they were nervous. He wasn't nervous. He was just there. When one of the nurses came out and gave Claire an update, culture's preliminary antibiotic course started, numbers stabilizing further, Claire nodded and asked 3 specific informed questions about the treatment protocol, and the nurse answered them with the respect of someone addressing a peer rather than a layperson, which told Adrian more about Claire's 2 months in that unit than anything else could have. After the nurse went back in, Claire sat with the information for a moment and then said, without looking at Adrian, "Thank you for staying." "Of course," he said. She stood up, straightened her jacket, picked up the composure she'd set down for the last hour, and put it back on, not all the way, but enough. She was going back in. "Get some rest tonight," he said, and then immediately wondered if that was the wrong thing to say. She turned and looked at him. "You too," she said, which was not nothing. The culture results came back the following morning. A bacterial infection, caught early enough for the antibiotics to be highly effective. By Wednesday, Ethan's numbers had stabilized into the range the attending physician was comfortable with, and by Thursday, 2 nurses in the unit were cautiously using the word responding when they updated Claire. Adrian got this information secondhand from Patrice, who mentioned it in passing during a site visit Thursday afternoon, and who watched him process it with the same reserved assessment she'd been directing at him for weeks. "You look relieved," she said. "I am relieved." She studied him. "You know this isn't simple, right? Whatever this is for you." "I know." "She's been through a significant amount," Patrice said, "and she's right at the most important moment of what she's been building. The timing of whatever you're working through. It needs to be her timing, not yours." "I understand that," Adrian said. He paused. "I'm not trying to insert myself into something that isn't mine. I don't want to disappear again. I spent 2 years doing that, and it was the easy thing and the wrong thing." Patrice held his gaze for a moment. "She's at the hospital most afternoons this week. She's barely left since Tuesday." He nodded. "I didn't tell you that for any particular reason," Patrice added, with the faint air of a woman who absolutely told him that for a particular reason. He went back to his mother's house on Wednesday evening. He hadn't planned to. It wasn't Sunday. It wasn't a scheduled dinner, but he found himself pulling into her street at 7 o'clock with the radio off, and she opened the door before he knocked because she had always had some internal alert system that told her when he was on his way. "Eat something," she said, which was how she began most things. "There's soup." He sat at the kitchen island and ate soup and told her about Ethan's crisis. He told her about sitting in the waiting area. He told her about Claire dropping the papers and crossing the room, the way she'd moved, and Margaret listened without interrupting, which was what she did when she was paying close attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You stayed," she said. "Yes." "Not because there was anything useful you could do." "No, there wasn't. I couldn't leave." She got up and refilled his bowl without asking if he wanted more, which was another one of her habits. "Tell me something honestly," she said, sitting back down. "Are you going to that hospital because of the project or because of her?" "Both." "In what proportion?" He considered it. "It started as mostly the project. Now the project is real. The scope expansion is real. But being there, being where she is, seeing what she does." He stopped. "I think I needed to see it, to understand what I walked away from, what I helped destroy." "You can't undo it," Margaret said. "I know." "That's not a comfort, it's just true. The question isn't undoing. The question is what you do with what you know now." He looked at her. "Do you think is there any version where—" "I don't know," his mother said simply, "and I'm not the right person to ask." "She is." She reached across and tapped his hand once, quickly. "But Adrian, there's something I want you to consider." "What?" "Whatever happens between you and Claire, and I mean whatever, including nothing, the person you're becoming by going through this honestly is someone worth being. Don't tie that to an outcome. Don't let the self-improvement be contingent on a reward." She held his gaze. "You understand what I mean?" He understood exactly what she meant, and it was not entirely comfortable. "You're saying I might do everything right, and it still might not matter to her," he said. "I'm saying that doing everything right shouldn't require it to matter to her in order to count." She leaned back. "You spent your whole career building things for an outcome. Buildings exist so that people can use them, but a man doesn't work that way. You don't become a better person so that you can trade it in for something." He sat with this. "Your father," she said, more quietly, Took 11 years to become the man I needed him to be. Not for me. He just grew into it, slowly and imperfectly because of what he went through. And then he was there, and I was there, and we had 20 more good years after the hard ones. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not telling you that's your story. I'm telling you that growth doesn't come with a guarantee. You do it anyway. The night before the adoption hearing, Adrian was in his office until 10 o'clock finishing the final revisions to the Crescent Expansion Board proposal. It was due in 2 days, and there were details in the Family Integration Program section that he wanted to be precise. He'd spent time with 3 different families in waiting at other hospitals over the past week, 2 by phone and 1 in person, trying to understand what would have helped them during the inpatient period. The conversations had been useful in the way that talking to people who have actually lived through something is always more useful than reading case studies about it. He also, around 9:30, opened the draft of the character reference letter he'd sent 3 weeks earlier and reread it one more time. He didn't know if it had mattered. He didn't know if Sandra Okafor had read it and found it credible, or if it had sat in a file alongside the other documentation and carried its small weight alongside everything else Claire had built. He hoped it had helped. He had no way of knowing and had made peace with not knowing, or was working on making peace with it, which was probably the more accurate description. He turned off his desk lamp at 10:15 and stood at the window for a minute looking at the city. The hospital was visible from here if you knew where to look. The cluster of lights on the south side of the commercial district, the particular pattern of a medical complex that didn't sleep. He thought about Claire, about where she was tonight. He hoped she was resting. He suspected she wasn't. He thought about Ethan, 8 weeks old and stubborn, growing in the careful machinery of the neonatal unit, his small body deciding, infection notwithstanding, to stay, to keep going. He thought about what it meant to fight for something that couldn't fight for itself yet, to stand in front of county paperwork and physician consultations and waiting areas and all the grinding institutional machinery between a child and a family, and to just keep going, to be there every day without guarantee of outcome. He thought that was one of the bravest things he'd ever been close to. He turned off the office light and rode the elevator down alone and drove home through the quiet city, and when he got to his apartment, he didn't sit in the dark the way he had in the early weeks after the divorce. He went to bed at a reasonable hour because there was work tomorrow and the day after, and he was not the same man who had needed the darkness as a place to stop feeling things. He was, slowly and imperfectly, becoming someone else. The adoption hearing was at 9 in the morning at the county family court building downtown. Adrian knew this because it was the date Claire had told him, weeks ago in the neonatal corridor. He was not at the family court building. He was at the hospital for a 7:30 meeting with the structural team. He was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to do. He checked his phone twice before 9, once at 8:45 and once at 9:10, which was the time the hearing would have started or been about to start. He put it face down on the conference table after that and paid attention to the structural engineer who was walking him through the revised load distribution for the East Pavilion Foundation. He did not hear anything that morning. He had not expected to. Claire had not said she would tell him how it went. That was not where they were. Whatever was building between them was building slowly, and he was trying to respect the pace of it, which was her pace, not his. At 12:30, he was eating lunch at his desk when his phone lit up. It was a text from a number he recognized but had not heard from in 2 years and 3 months and some days. Hearing adjourned. Judge wants supplemental documentation on housing certification. 3 weeks. He stared at it. Then he typed back, "I'm sorry, that's a hard delay." A minute passed. Then, "It's not a denial. Social worker says it's procedural. Is there anything I can do?" Another pause. Longer this time. He sat with the waiting. "No. Thank you." He set the phone down. He thought about the word procedural and how it lived in the same sentence as 3 more weeks, and how that sentence had to land in Claire's body like a stone, regardless of what the social worker called it. 3 weeks of procedural was 3 weeks of Ethan not being legally hers. 3 weeks of forms and certifications, and the machinery grinding along while a 9-week-old baby waited in an incubator for his life to formally begin. He thought about what he could do that wasn't nothing but also wasn't overstepping. He picked up the phone and called Dennis. "The housing certification," he said, "for Claire's adoption application. The county wants supplemental documentation. Do we know what firm did her home study?" A pause. How would I know that? Dr. Hargrove might. He stopped. Actually, Sandra Okafor at County Family Services. She's the caseworker. I have her contact information. Adrian, Dennis said carefully, what are you thinking? I'm thinking the Blackwood Group has a housing compliance and certification division, and if there's a documentation gap in a home study that's holding up an adoption, we can probably close it faster than the standard administrative timeline. Silence on the line. We don't typically. I know what we typically do, Adrian said. I'm asking about this specific case. Can we do it or not? Dennis exhaled. I'd have to look at the specifics of the certification issue. If it's a documentation problem and not an actual compliance issue, then yes, probably. It's a couple of hours of someone's time. Find out what the issue is. Quietly, don't make it a production. And if she asks where the help came from? Adrian thought about this. Tell her the hospital's family advocacy coordinator reached out, which is something Dr. Hargrove would have done anyway, probably, if she'd known. So it's close enough to true. Another pause. You realize this is not how we normally operate. No, Adrian agreed. It's better. He hung up and went back to his lunch, which was cold now, and ate it anyway because it was there and skipping meals was a habit that made the afternoon meetings go poorly. His phone lit up again 20 minutes later. Another text from Claire. The judge mentioned the character reference letter in the record. Said it was compelling. He read it twice. Then he typed, good. And then he put the phone down and got back to work because that was what you did. You did the thing and then you kept going. You didn't wait for the recognition to land before moving on to the next thing that needed doing. He understood that now in a way he hadn't before. You didn't build something good and then stand in front of it waiting to be told it was good. You built the next part. The 3 weeks moved at the particular pace of difficult waiting, which is to say slower than any other kind. Adrian came to the hospital most days, and most days he saw Claire briefly, and most days those encounters were the kind that couldn't be called anything yet. Not quite friendship, not quite reconciliation, not the simple professionalism of two people thrown together by circumstance. Something that existed in its own category and didn't have a clean label. She talked to him more easily than she had in October, not openly, not without the careful management she maintained, but with less distance. She told him things about Ethan's progress. She asked him once, directly, about the family integration program and what stage the planning was at, and they talked for 20 minutes about the structural layout of the proposed space and the staffing model, and it was a real conversation, the kind where both people were present in it. He told her once, because she asked, that he had learned he was adopted. He said it simply and without making it into more than it was. She was quiet for a moment after he said it. When did you find out? About a month ago. My mother told me. She looked at him. How did that feel? He thought about it seriously before answering. Like the floor moved. And then a lot of things made more sense than they had before. She nodded slowly. There was something in her eyes that might have been the accumulated weight of a very particular irony. This man, this specific man, who had told her that bloodline was the only way, who had built an entire refusal on a foundation that turned out to be something other than he'd thought. She didn't say any of that out loud. She didn't have to. I know, he said quietly. I know what it means. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, the housing certification came through. The adoption coordinator said it was processed faster than usual. Good, he said. She looked at him in the particular way she had, the look that meant she was putting something together. Was that you? He didn't answer right away. Adrian? It was a documentation issue that someone was able to resolve quickly, he said. The outcome is what matters. She held his gaze for another beat. Something moved through her expression. Complex, layered, nothing he was going to be able to name in a corridor with nurses walking past. The new hearing is Thursday, she said finally. I know. I'd like you to. She stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence or how much of it she wanted to say. I'd like someone to know that it's Thursday, what time it is. She looked down at her hands for a moment. In case it goes the way it's supposed to go and I need somewhere to... I don't know. I'll know, he said. 9 o'clock. She looked up at him. Sandra mentioned the time when she emailed the revised documentation confirmation. He said, I happened to see it. She knew he hadn't happened to see it. They both knew. Okay, she said. Not warm, not cold. Something in between that had its own particular weight, the weight of a door left not quite all the way closed. She went back to the neonatal unit. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he went back to work, because there was still the East Wing to get right, and Ethan's pavilion to design properly, and the board presentation in 2 days, and a dozen other things that needed doing before Thursday. He kept moving. He was learning the only real answer to most things. Not the performing of motion, not busyness as a substitute for feeling, but actual movement. Forward. Into the next thing that needed building. He was becoming, slowly and with significant imperfection, the man who understood that. Thursday came in cold and gray, the kind of late November morning that made the city look like it was holding its breath. Adrian was at his desk by 7:15. He had a full day scheduled, a contractor meeting at 8, a call with the hospital board's finance subcommittee at 10:30, and a site visit in the afternoon to review the demolition prep on the East Wing's first phase. He'd arranged the day deliberately, filling it with things that required his attention, because he understood himself well enough to know that an unstructured Thursday with nothing to occupy his hands was a Thursday he'd spend watching the clock move toward 9 o'clock. He watched the clock move toward 9 o'clock anyway. At 8:58, he put his phone face up on the corner of his desk where he could see it without having to reach for it, and he went back to the contractor meeting notes, and he did not stare at the phone. He stared at the phone. At 9:47, while the contractor was walking him through a revised timeline for the East Wing foundation work, his phone lit up. He did not pick it up immediately. He let the contractor finish the sentence he was in the middle of, which was about drainage pipe specifications, and which was a legitimate and important sentence about drainage pipe specifications, and then he said, "Give me 1 minute," and he looked at the screen. A text from Claire. 2 words. "It's done." He read it twice. Then he excused himself from the meeting, walked to the window, and stood there looking out at the gray city for a moment, and he felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight since the first hearing 3 weeks ago. He typed back, "Congratulations. He's yours." The response took a few minutes. He'd gone back to the meeting and was making himself pay attention when the phone buzzed again. "He's been mine." Now the paperwork agrees. He read that one 3 times. The contractor meeting wrapped up at 10. Adrian had 20 minutes before the finance call. He used 15 of them to walk around the block outside his building, which was not something he typically did and which Maria clocked when he came back in with the particular expression she reserved for things she was filing away. He didn't explain himself. He just felt like he needed to be outside for a few minutes, like the inside of his office was too small for what the morning had turned into. He thought about Ethan, about a child who had been left at an emergency entrance with no name on file, no one coming, and who had spent the first weeks of his life in an incubator while the machinery of a hospital and a county family services office slowly, imperfectly, ground through its processes. And now a judge had looked at the paperwork and the home study and the social worker's report and the character references and the housing certification and had stamped something official that said, "This child belongs to this woman," which was true. Which had been true for weeks already, in every way that mattered, and which was now also true on paper. He went back upstairs and got on his finance call. He saw her that afternoon. He'd come in for the site visit at 2, and she was in the neonatal unit. She was always in the neonatal unit. But today there was something different about the quality of her presence there. She was still. In a way he didn't usually see her still. She was sitting in the rocking chair with Ethan against her chest, not doing anything, not talking to a nurse or reading a monitor or managing something, just sitting with him, her hand on his back in the way she always held him, secure and easy. She saw Adrian through the glass, and this time she didn't look away. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she lifted her chin very slightly in a gesture that said, "Come in." He badged in with the hospital visitor credentials he'd had since the project began. He walked through the unit quietly, past the other bays, to the corner where she was sitting. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at Ethan, 10 weeks old now, filling out a little, his color good, his chest rising and falling with the reliable steadiness of someone who had decided to stay. He was asleep. He doesn't know yet, Claire said quietly. What today meant. He'll know it in the way things become true for children, Adrian said, equally quiet. Without being able to name it, he'll just know this is his life. She looked down at Ethan. That's what I want for him. That it's just normal. That he never spends a lot of time on the other version. Some people would say he should know the story. He'll know the story when he's ready for it, when it's something he can hold. Right now he just needs to know this. She adjusted him slightly against her shoulder. That he's held. Adrian stood there for a moment. He thought about himself at 3 weeks old, taken home by two people who were not his biology, and who had given him the particular gift of never making him feel the distance of that. He had grown up knowing he was wanted. The wanting had been the foundation, and the foundation had been solid, and he had built himself on it without ever examining what it was made of. He thought about the boy his mother had spent 30 years trying to protect from a truth she thought might damage him. He thought that the truth had not damaged him. The not knowing had been the problem. Not because the truth was harmful, but because it had left him constructing a self on premises he'd never tested. Claire, he said. She looked up. I want to say something, and I want you to know it doesn't require anything from you. It's not an ask. He paused, making sure that was still true before he continued. What you've done here, what you've built with him, it changed the way I see things. Things I thought I understood. Things I was wrong about. She watched him. I spent our entire marriage, he said, believing that what I was protecting was legacy. Bloodline. The Blackwood name meaning something beyond me. And now I know that I was adopted, and the name means exactly what it always meant, which is the people who showed up. That's it. That's the whole inheritance. He looked at Ethan. You figured that out without needing the revelation. You just knew. Claire was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful. I didn't figure it out, she said. I stumbled into it. There was a baby and nobody came, and I just couldn't walk away. She looked down at Ethan. That's not wisdom. That's just being unable to do the easier thing. That's what wisdom usually is, he said. She looked at him again. That look. Assessing, not unkind, not closed. I found your letter in the court file, she said. Sandra let me read it. He hadn't known she'd read it. He'd assumed it was possible, but hadn't let himself expect it. Okay. It was honest, she said. It didn't sound like you trying to fix something. It wasn't. It sounded like you saying something true. That was the intention, he said. She was quiet. She looked back at Ethan and adjusted her hold on him, and he shifted slightly in his sleep with the particular total trust of a sleeping infant, all his weight given over to whoever was holding him. The pavilion, she said after a moment. The family integration space. When does that break ground? January, if the board approves the final construction docs next month, which they will. That's good. She said it with a directness that meant she wasn't just making conversation. She cared about it specifically, about the actual space and what it would do. The families who are in our situation right now, in between, legally, they need somewhere to be that isn't just the waiting area chairs. I know, that's what I'm building. She looked at him. Why? He held her gaze. Because I've sat in those chairs, and I understand what they're for. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite that, but something. Go do your site visit, she said finally. You're going to be late. Probably, he said. He looked at Ethan one more time. Then he left the unit quietly, the way the space required, and went to find his hard hat. The demolition on the East Wing's first phase began the second week of December. It was not dramatic demolition, not the kind with a crane and a wrecking ball that people came to watch. It was careful, methodical, interior work. The removal of non-load-bearing walls, the stripping of old electrical conduit, the precise opening of floors for new drainage runs. The kind of work that looked like destruction but was actually preparation. You had to take apart what was there before you could build what came next. Adrian was on site most mornings for the first week. Not because he needed to be. Dennis was more than capable of managing the day-to-day, but because he liked being present at the beginning of things. He liked knowing the bones of a project. He also liked being close to the hospital, though he had stopped interrogating that particular fact. He and Claire had settled into something over the preceding weeks that he couldn't name precisely, but which had its own rhythm. They crossed paths most days. Sometimes they talked for a few minutes, sometimes for longer. She updated him on Ethan's progress with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who has decided you're safe enough to tell things to, not the careful rationing of someone who is still deciding. He asked questions that were genuine questions, not pretexts for more time. She never brought up the marriage directly. Neither did he. It was there, obviously. It was always there, the shared history of it, the wreckage and what had caused the wreckage, but it sat in the room between them like something they'd both agreed to let sit for now. Not avoid, just let be. There would be time for it or there wouldn't, and neither of them was in a position to know which yet. He could live with not knowing. That was new for him. The not knowing used to require action, used to require the management of things, the control of outcomes. He was learning to let time be time. On a Wednesday in mid-December, he ran into her in the hospital cafeteria for the first time. They'd always met in corridors, in the neonatal unit, in the family consultation spaces, always in the purposeful parts of the hospital. The cafeteria was different. It was where people sat with bad food and complicated feelings and the middle of their days. She was at a table alone with a salad she wasn't eating and her phone face down in front of her, staring at nothing. He got coffee and stood with it for a moment, and then he walked over and said, "Do you want company, or do you want to be left alone?" She looked up, something tired in her face. "Company," she said. "If you're not in a rush." He sat down. "What's wrong?" "Nothing specific." She picked up her fork, put it down. "The discharge date might be next week." He felt the shape of this. "That's good," he said carefully. "It is good," she agreed. "It's what we've been working toward." He's been off all supplemental support for 2 weeks, and his weight is where they want it, and the pediatrician did the developmental assessment yesterday, and she was very encouraging. She paused. "And I have to take him home, to an apartment with a crib I set up in October, and a car seat in the box, and all the things I bought before the hearing in case—" She stopped. "In case it went the way it went," he said. "Yes." She looked at her hands. "And now it has. And now I take him home, and it's just me." She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "I've been the person who shows up at the hospital, every day. I know how to do that part. The going home part is, I don't have the same muscle memory for it." "Nobody does," Adrian said. "At first." She looked at him. "What would you know about it?" "I know that the first time anything real happens, you don't have muscle memory for it. You're just in it. And then you're in it again the next day, and the one after that, and eventually you know how to do it because you've been doing it." He paused. "That's not insight. It's just time." She considered him. "You've gotten better at saying true things." "I'm practicing." The corner of her mouth moved. "You have a ways to go." "Significant ways," he agreed. She picked up her fork again and actually ate some of the salad, which he took as a minor positive sign. "There's a woman in the unit," she said. "Her name is Rosalind. She's been there for 3 months with her premature twins. She's by herself. The father's not in the picture. She can't afford to take extended leave, and she's been trying to arrange things, and it's the kind of situation where everything that can go wrong in terms of systems and support does go wrong." "Tell me about the specifics," Adrian said. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because if there are specific problems with specific solutions, I'd like to know what they are." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, without making it into more than it was, she told him. The housing issue. Rosalind's apartment lease was coming up for renewal while she was managing the hospital situation, and she was at risk of losing it because she couldn't be in 2 places at once. The childcare gap. She'd need some kind of covered support arrangement when she returned to work, which her job required within 60 days of the twins' discharge. The paperwork burden. She was navigating insurance appeals and county benefit applications simultaneously. Adrian listened. He didn't take notes, but he retained all of it. "I can connect her with our housing compliance team," he said. "If the lease issue is a documentation problem, that's a phone call. For the childcare, the Blackwood Foundation has a fund specifically for this. It doesn't get used often because most people don't know about it. Her situation is exactly what it's for." Claire was looking at him. "Your foundation has a childcare fund." "My father set it up in the 80s. It was originally for employees in hardship situations. We quietly extended it to community partners about 5 years ago. I had Maria dig it up last month, actually. He paused. I was thinking about cases like Rosalind's. You were thinking about it before you knew about Rosalind. I was thinking about what this unit deals with, he said, and what resources exist that aren't being connected to the people who need them. He picked up his coffee. Ask her if she'd like to talk to someone. I'll set it up through the hospital's patient advocacy coordinator so it comes from the right channel. Claire looked at him for a long moment, not calculating, not suspicious. Something more like reorientation, the particular look of someone adjusting a perception they've been carrying. You've changed, she said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation. I'm trying, he said. It's not the same thing, but it's what I have. She nodded slowly. It's something, she said. Ethan came home 6 days before Christmas. Adrian knew because Claire texted him. Not an announcement. A short, practical message that said the discharge was set for Tuesday morning and asked if there were any outstanding construction access issues that would affect parking near the hospital's main entrance. He'd arranged for the East Wing access to be temporarily closed on Tuesday morning to minimize congestion, and he told her so. She didn't respond to that, but at 11:47 on Tuesday, she sent, "We're home." He was in a meeting. He read it under the table. He typed back, "Good. How is he?" She responded immediately, which meant she was looking at her phone, which meant she was probably sitting somewhere in that apartment with the crib and the car seat, and Ethan, finding her footing in the new part. Confused, loud, perfect. He smiled at his phone in a meeting for the first time in recent memory. Dennis, across the table, noticed and carefully did not react. "That sounds about right," Adrian typed back. Then after a moment, "You know how to do this, Claire. You've been doing it since October." A pause. Then, "That's not bad. I'm practicing. Still a ways to go." He put the phone in his pocket and went back to the meeting and thought that wherever she was, in that apartment with that baby and the new muscle memory she was building, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Buggies. January brought the groundbreaking. It was a small ceremony. A few hospital board members, the project team, some hospital staff, a couple of local officials. They'd set up a modest area near the construction fence on the east side, which was not glamorous real estate for a groundbreaking, but the actual location was real, and that mattered to Adrian more than staging. He gave brief remarks. He talked about the expansion in the language of public events, community need, long-term investment, the hospital's commitment to the most vulnerable patients, standard construction ceremony language, except that he deviated from the prepared remarks at the end because he'd been doing that more lately, saying the actual thing instead of the prepared version. "A hospital like this one," he said, "is a place where life starts and where it gets repaired. The work we do in places like this one," he gestured at the construction fence, at the hospital behind it. "It only means something if the building serves the people who need it most, not the people who are easy to serve, the ones who are hardest to reach. That's what this expansion is for." He stepped back. Brief applause. The hospital board chair said a few words. Dr. Hargrove said a few more that were sharper and more to the point, as she tended to be. Claire was there. He hadn't known she would be. He saw her standing at the edge of the gathered group, Ethan in a carrier against her chest. 10 weeks adjusted age now, wide awake and apparently interested in the winter sky. She had one hand on his back, the habit so thoroughly established it was probably unconscious. When the ceremony wrapped and people began moving back inside, he made his way over to her. She was talking to Patrice, who had come out from the unit, and when he reached them, Patrice gave him a measured look that contained approximately 12 different assessments before she said, "Good remarks," and excused herself. "You came," he said. "Patrice told me there was a groundbreaking." She adjusted Ethan slightly. "I wanted to see it." He looked at Ethan. The baby was looking at him, not focusing exactly, still developing that particular skill, but oriented toward him in the general way he oriented toward things that were new. Adrian held still and let him look. "Hi," he said, to the baby, somewhat ridiculously. Claire watched this with an expression he couldn't name. "He's gotten bigger," Adrian said. "That's what they do." "Does he sleep?" "Occasionally. between 5 and 7 in the morning, which is when I would like most to be asleep. So we're still negotiating the terms. A wry note in her voice, the particular dry humor she got when she was tired but not defeated. Are you managing? Most days? She said it without the performance of being fine, just honestly. Some days are harder. He got me up 4 times last night, and I cried in the kitchen at 2 in the morning over nothing specific. And this morning I found my keys in the refrigerator, and I've been wearing 2 different socks since 7 a.m. She looked at him. But he smiled at me this morning. Probably gas, the pediatrician says, but it looked like a smile. It counts as a smile, Adrian said. That's what I decided, she agreed. He looked at Ethan. He thought about the note Patrice had made in passing 3 months ago. She's been through a lot to get here. He thought about the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the refrigerator keys, the socks, the specific texture of doing something important and difficult without the backup you were supposed to have. He thought about what he wanted to say and how to say it without making it about himself. I know it's not my place, he said. And I know I'm not trying to insert myself into something that's yours. But if you ever need backup, coverage, someone to sit with him for 2 hours while you sleep, I know that's not a simple offer, and I'm not making it simply. He held her gaze. I'm making it because I'm available and because I want to be useful in a real way, and because the last 3 months have given me a picture of what real means. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a complicated offer, she said. I know. It doesn't fix what happened. I know that too. And I'm nowhere near a place where I know what anything between us is or isn't. I'm not there. I'm still in the 2 in the morning crying about nothing in the kitchen phase. I understand. She looked down at Ethan, who had decided the winter sky was more interesting than Adrian and had redirected his attention upward. She was quiet for a moment. I might call you, she said finally, if I need backup. That's not a commitment to anything. That's just, I might call. That's all I'm offering, he said. She looked back at him. Is it? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. It isn't all I'm offering, but it's what I'm asking for right now. Because right now is what I can manage, and I'm trying to do things in the right order this time. She considered this. Something in her face that was not the careful management she'd been maintaining. Something slightly more unguarded, slightly closer to the person she'd been before everything. Okay, she said. It was not a resolution. It was not a promise or a beginning or a moment that could be identified later as the thing that changed. It was just okay. One word. Standing in the January cold outside a hospital with the groundbreaking certificate going into a folder somewhere and construction beginning in the East Wing and a baby looking at the winter sky. But okay was something. Okay was a door left open. He knew how to work with open. The weeks between January groundbreaking and the pavilion's March completion were the kind of weeks that blurred at the edges. Constant motion, constant decision-making, the particular exhausted focus of a project in its final drive. Adrian was on site more than he was in his office, which was the way he'd preferred it in the early years of the company, before the company had gotten large enough to require him to manage it from a distance. He'd told Dennis recently that he wanted to be closer to the work again. Dennis had said, "You've been saying that for 5 years." Adrian had said, "I mean it this time." Dennis had looked at him with the expression of a man who believed him and was quietly reserving judgment until the evidence accumulated. The evidence was accumulating. The family integration space took shape in late February. It was the component he'd fought hardest for in the board discussions. Not the largest piece of the expansion, but the one with the most specificity. 2 connected rooms adjacent to the neonatal unit. One set up for extended stays, with comfortable furniture and space for a family to be a family without being in a medical environment, and one with resources for the legal and administrative process. A person on staff whose entire job was to sit with families in transition. Not a social worker exactly, not a case manager exactly, but a navigator. Someone who could look at a situation like Rosalind's and say, here is the housing resource, here is the foundation fund, here is the person to call about the insurance appeal. He'd hired for that role from within the hospital's existing staff. A woman named Keisha, who had been doing the job informally for years, as a side function of her patient advocacy work, because she couldn't not do it. She'd agreed to the new role with a directness that reminded him of Claire. He told Claire about Keisha's hiring during one of their cafeteria lunches, which had become a semi-regular thing, not scheduled, just arriving at the same place at approximately the same time often enough that it had developed a pattern. She'd started occasionally bringing Ethan when he was with her for the day, propped in a car seat on the chair beside her. Adrian had learned how to manage a conversation while simultaneously keeping track of the small universe of Ethan's expressions. "That's exactly the right call," Claire said about Keisha. "She already knows where all the gaps are. She's been falling into them for years trying to help people." "That's what she said," Adrian said, almost word for word. Smart woman. She was cutting a piece of chicken with the focused efficiency of someone eating on a schedule. Rosalind started the childcare fund process, by the way. Sandra helped her with the paperwork. "I know, Keisha mentioned it. The twins come home in 3 weeks. She's terrified." "That seems appropriate," Adrian said. "I told her the same thing." Claire glanced at Ethan, who was working on a fist with deep concentration. "I also told her the first 2 weeks are completely surreal, and then your body just adjusts. You stop expecting sleep to be what it was. You recalibrate." "Is that how it went for you?" "More or less. The first night I barely put him down. I just held him." She said it without embarrassment. "I kept thinking something was going to go wrong if I looked away. And now? Now I put him down and go 3 feet away and panic a normal amount instead of an extreme amount." She almost smiled. Progress. He looked at Ethan, at the small, purposeful face, at Claire's hand resting on the edge of the car seat, close but not holding on, the practiced ease of 3 months of exactly this. "He looks like he knows what he wants," Adrian said. "He wants everything," Claire said, loudly. "At 2 in the morning, sounds exhausting." "It is." She looked at her son. "I've never been less tired in my life." He sat with that paradox. He thought he understood it, not from experience, not from anything he'd actually lived, but from watching her for 3 months and from what his mother had said about his father and about the 20 years after the hard ones. The tiredness and the not tiredness being the same thing, the paradox being the point. He didn't say any of that out loud. Some understandings were better held quietly. She called him on a Tuesday night in late February. It was 9:15, and he was in his kitchen eating something he'd ordered because he still didn't cook. And when he saw her name on the screen, he answered on the second ring. "Is everything all right?" he said. "Yes, sorry, it's late. I just..." A pause. He could hear Ethan in the background, not crying, just making the small sounds of a baby being awake at 9:15. "I've been thinking about something and I wanted to ask you directly instead of letting it sit." "Okay." "The pavilion opening. Is there a ceremony?" "Yes." "Mid-March. The board wants a ribbon cutting. Are you going to talk?" "At the ceremony." "That's the plan," he said. "What are you going to say?" He leaned against the counter. "I haven't written it yet. The broad version is what the expansion means for the community, the purpose-built spaces, the family integration program, the usual." "And the real version," she said, "not the usual." He thought about it. He thought about what he actually wanted to say, the thing underneath the public language. "The buildings are only as good as what they're built for," he said. "That you can put up walls and run the right wiring and meet every code, and it means nothing if the people inside it aren't the right people. People who actually understand what the space needs to do." He paused. "That I've spent a career building things, and I'm only now learning which part of the work matters." She was quiet on the other end for a moment. "That's the speech," she said. "It might be too much for a ribbon cutting." "No," she said. "It's not." A pause. "I'll be there, at the opening." He didn't say anything immediately because the right response to that wasn't immediate. "Okay," he said finally, "with Ethan. He'll probably sleep through the whole thing." "That's all right," Adrian said. "He can hear it anyway." Another silence. Comfortable, somehow. The particular quiet of a phone call that has said what it needed to say and isn't in a hurry to end. "I should put him down," Claire said finally. "Yeah." "Adrian." A pause. "The housing certification, for my application." He waited. "I know it was you," she said. "Fully, I always knew. I just wanted you to know that I know. He didn't try to re-explain it. Okay? Thank you, she said. Plain, direct, no inflation. You would have gotten there anyway, he said. Probably slower, she said, and slower mattered. He heard the truth of that. Get some sleep, he said. You too, she said, the way she always said it, like a door left ajar. He stood in his kitchen after the call ended and thought about March, about the ribbon cutting, about Ethan sleeping through a speech he might someday understand and might not, and either way it would be the same world for him, the world where Claire had decided and where a building had been built for the right reasons, and where a man had slowly and imperfectly started figuring out which parts of his life had actually been worth keeping. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing what it always did. All those lights, all those separate lives arranged in their grids. He'd spent a lot of years looking at it as a project, as something to build in and on and through. It looked different now. Not smaller, just more specific, more real in the way that real things are when you stop managing them and start being in them. He finished eating and washed the single dish and went to bed at a reasonable hour, which was still something that required intention, but less than it used to. The pavilion would open in 17 days. He had a speech to write. He sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. Not his laptop, not a document, just paper. And he wrote the first line, then the second. Then he kept going. The morning of the pavilion opening arrived with the kind of weather that doesn't know what it wants to be. Not quite winter anymore, not yet spring, the sky a pale washed-out gray that kept threatening rain and then reconsidering. The trees along the hospital's main drive had the first uncertain suggestion of green at their tips, the tentative kind that could still be taken back by a hard frost. Adrian was at the hospital by 7. He hadn't slept well. Not badly, not the old kind of sleeplessness that had been about dread and avoidance, but the lighter kind that comes when your mind won't stop running through something that matters. He'd reviewed the speech 3 times before midnight, and then put it away and told himself he knew it well enough, which he did, and then lay in the dark thinking about the sequence of the last 5 months anyway. October to March. One project proposal that had turned into something he hadn't anticipated and couldn't have planned. He thought about the specific October Tuesday when he'd walked into the Crescent lobby in a charcoal suit that cost too much, with his project manager half a step behind him and his schedule memorized and his entire sense of himself intact and organized. He thought about what 5 months had done to that organization. Not destroyed it. He was still himself. Still the same person who ran the same company and knew how to look at a building and understand its bones. But rearranged. The furniture of who he was had been moved, and some pieces he'd thought were essential had turned out to be decoration. And some things he'd kept in the back because they didn't fit the aesthetic he'd been cultivating were now in the front where they belonged. He walked the new pavilion alone in the early morning quiet before the setup crew arrived. The east wing looked nothing like it had in October. The original structure was still there. You could see the bones of it in the load-bearing elements, the original foundation that the new construction was built on. But everything above and around it had been transformed. New light, new proportions. The family integration space was at the junction of old and new, which had been deliberate, which Dennis had thought was unnecessarily symbolic, and which Adrian had insisted on anyway. He stood in the family integration room for a while. The comfortable chairs, the warm lighting, the small adjacent resource room with its shelves of actual useful information rather than the decorative pamphlets that hospitals typically provided. Keisha had been in twice already to arrange things to her specifications, and her specifications were better than his, so he'd let her run it. He thought about Claire in October. In the rocking chair through the glass, her hands folded in front of her mouth, deciding something he hadn't understood yet. He thought about a man who had walked into this building to oversee a project and had walked back out, slowly, over 5 months, into a version of himself he was still getting acquainted with. He thought, some structures can be built on the same foundation as what came before, if you understand which parts were actually solid to begin with. Then he heard the setup crew arriving, and he went to go check on the podium placement. By 10 o'clock, the atrium of the new East Pavilion had filled with the particular combination of people that gathered for hospital events. Board members in suits, clinical staff in varying degrees of formal dress, a few local officials, journalists from 2 community newspapers, families who had been connected to the unit and had been invited specifically. Rosalind was there with her twins, who were 4 months old now and asleep in a double stroller, which was a minor miracle that everyone in earshot agreed to credit to timing and not question. Patrice was there in her good coat. Dr. Hargrove moved through the room with the contained energy of someone who had been working toward this for years and was not going to let anyone see how much it meant to her. Margaret Blackwood was there. She'd arrived at 9:30 and found her son before the room filled and held his arm for a moment without saying anything, which was a thing she did when words weren't the right tool. "You did good work," she said. "We'll see how it holds up," he said, which was what he always said about buildings. "I'm not talking about the building," she said, and let go of his arm and went to find her seat. He watched her go and thought about the dinner in October. The kitchen island, the truth she'd been carrying for 50 years because she didn't know how to put it down, and because she'd been trying to protect him from something that turned out not to need the protecting she'd been doing. He thought about how it had landed, the floor moving, and then the making sense. He had not contacted Patricia Marsh. He didn't know if he ever would. He'd thought about it, turned the question over several times, and had arrived at the conclusion that he didn't need to, not right now, and maybe not ever. And that was something he got to decide in his own time. Margaret was his mother. That was simply and completely true. The biology was a fact about the past, not a reassignment of anything that mattered. He understood this now in the way he understood things that had become real rather than theoretical, not as a concept he'd reasoned his way to, as something he actually felt. Claire arrived at 10:15. He saw her come through the main entrance from across the room, which was not difficult because the room was already watching the door with the anticipatory attention of a crowd waiting for things to begin, and she walked in with Ethan in the carrier against her chest. 3 months old now, 4 months adjusted, his head up with the new muscular confidence of a baby who has recently discovered he can hold it there. She was wearing a dark blue dress he didn't recognize, which meant she'd bought it for today, which told him something about what today meant to her. Her hair was down. He'd seen it down twice in the entire 5 months, and both times it had landed somewhere in him that he'd been learning to be careful with. She scanned the room, found him. He crossed to her, working through the gathering crowd, and when he reached her, she said, "We made it," with the mild triumph of a woman who has dressed a 3-month-old for a formal event. "How is he?" Adrian said, looking at Ethan. "Alert," she said. "He slept the entire drive over, and now he's prepared to observe everything." Ethan was in fact looking around the room with the particular expression of someone who has opinions forming. He caught Adrian in his field of vision and held there for a moment. "Hi," Adrian said. Same as the groundbreaking. Still somewhat ridiculous. Ethan, for the first time in Adrian's experience, smiled at him. Clear and unmistakable. Not gas, just a smile. The total unself-conscious expression of a face that doesn't yet know anything about withholding. Something cracked open in Adrian's chest quietly, without drama. Just a small give, like a window opening. He looked at Claire. "He does that now," she said, like she was apologizing for it. "He should," Adrian said. "He should do it whenever he wants." She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that she didn't cover, just for a second, before the room pressed in around them and someone from the board came over to say something to Adrian about the program order. The ceremony began at 10:30. There were 3 speakers before Adrian, Dr. Hargrove, the board chair, and a county official who said the right things about community investment and healthcare access. They were all competent, and Adrian had stopped hearing them approximately 40 seconds in because he was going over the speech in his head. Not the words exactly, but the reason behind the words. Making sure he knew why he was saying what he was saying before he said it. He looked out at the room while the county official spoke. He found Rosalind and the stroller. Patrice in her good coat, his mother in the 3rd row, hands folded in her lap. Dennis near the back with the quiet relief of a project manager whose project has reached the ribbon cutting. Keisha near the side wall, standing rather than sitting, the way people stand when they're too energized to be still. Claire was 4 rows back to the left. Ethan was looking at the ceiling lights with deep interest. Adrian looked at the ceiling for a moment to see what Ethan was seeing. The new pavilion lighting was warm and indirect. Keisha had insisted on it during the finishes review, saying fluorescent light in a space designed for families was counterproductive. And she'd been right. The lights were good. even from a 3-month-old's perspective, apparently. The county official finished. The board chair invited Adrian to the podium. He walked up. He looked at the room. He looked at his prepared remarks on the lectern, and then he looked back at the room because the prepared remarks were there if he needed them, and he didn't think he was going to need them. He started talking. When the Crescent Memorial expansion was first proposed, he said, I had a very clear idea of what it was. A construction project. Square footage and load-bearing specifications and drainage management and a timeline that I was going to bring in under budget, because that's what the Blackwood Group does. A few sounds of polite recognition from the board members. I had that idea for about 3 weeks, and then I started spending time in this hospital, and the idea I had stopped being adequate. He paused. I want to talk about what this building is for, he said. Not the official version, the board presentation version, but the actual version, because I think the actual version is what matters. He looked at the room. This building is for the person who doesn't know what day it is because they've been sleeping in 20-minute stretches for 2 weeks, and their whole life has rearranged itself around someone else's needs, and they didn't know it would be this hard, and they didn't know they were capable of this kind of love, and both of those things are true at the same time. He let that sit for a moment. This building is for the family in between. Not the family that has arrived, not the family that's comfortably settled, the family that's still in process, still in paperwork, still in the 3 a.m. waiting room, still doing the thing where they show up every day without a guarantee of outcome because they can't do the easier thing. The room was quiet. I spent a long time believing that family was a specific, narrow thing, he said. I believed it was about blood and names and biological legacy, and I built a significant part of my identity on that belief. And I was wrong. He said it plainly. Not wrong in a complicated, nuanced way, just wrong. And I didn't know how wrong I was until I watched someone in this hospital in that neonatal unit do the daily, unglamorous, remarkable work of deciding to belong to a child who needed somebody to belong to, without obligation, without guarantee, just because she could and because she chose to. He didn't look at Claire. He didn't need to. He wasn't saying it to her specifically. He was saying it because it was true, and it needed to be said in a room full of people who were navigating the same territory or would be. What I understand now, he said, is that family is not created. It's not inherited. It's not assigned. And it's not something you arrive at automatically because of how someone came into the world. It is built, the same way anything real is built, through daily decision, through showing up when you're tired, through choosing the hard thing because the easy thing would cost you something you're not willing to lose. He looked at Rosalind, who was looking back at him with an expression he wasn't going to try to name. This pavilion, he said, is built on the same foundation as the old East Wing. The original hospital, over 100 years old, a lot of it structurally original. We didn't tear it down. We built on what was solid and changed what wasn't. And now there's something here that didn't exist before. That's usually how it works, when it works right. He paused. You don't have to demolish everything that came before in order to build something worth having. You have to know which parts of the foundation were actually solid, and you have to be honest about which parts you told yourself were solid because it was easier than looking at them clearly. He picked up the prepared remarks from the lectern and moved them to the side. To the families this building is for, he said. To the ones in the waiting room, and the ones in the integration space, and the ones doing the paperwork for the 3rd time because the first 2 had complications. To the navigators and the advocates and the people who make this institution run. Not the board, not the administrators. The people in the unit at 7 in the morning who know which baby likes to face the light. To the nurses who named a child so he'd have something to be called while the world figured out where he belonged. He looked at Patrice, who looked away very quickly and then looked back. You built this too. This building exists because of what you do. All we did was put walls around it. He stepped back from the podium. The applause started and he heard it from a distance, the way you hear things when you're still in the inside of something. He shook the board chair's hand and nodded at Dr. Hargrove, who gave him the look she'd been giving him since October, the one holding its judgment in reserve, except that now the reserve was gone and what was underneath it was simply, yes, that. He stepped down from the platform and the program moved to the ribbon cutting, and he stood where he was supposed to stand and cut the ribbon with the ceremonial scissors that were slightly too large and felt absurd in his hand, and the photographer from both newspapers took the picture, and the room shifted into reception mode. He found Claire 20 minutes later at the edge of the family integration room, looking through the doorway at the space. Ethan had fallen asleep, apparently having decided that the speech was sufficient stimulation for one morning. He was entirely out, head heavy on her shoulder, the total unconscious weight of a sleeping infant. "He made it 20 minutes into the reception," she said without turning around. New record. Adrian stood beside her and looked into the room. Keisha was already in there, talking to a family he didn't recognize, a young couple with the exhausted, luminous quality of people who have been through something hard and are on the other side of it. There was a baby and a stroller between them. "Is that a family from the unit?" he said. "The Garcias. Their daughter was in there for 11 weeks. She went home last month." Claire watched them for a moment. Keisha met with them twice while she was still inpatient, helped them through the insurance thing. "Good," Adrian said. "It's going to matter," Claire said. "This space, what Keisha does here." She turned and looked at him. "The speech was good." "Parts of it," he said. "Most of it." She shifted Ethan slightly. "The part about daily decision, choosing because you can and because you choose to." She paused. "That was the part." He held her gaze. "I've had a good teacher." "You've had a 5-month crash course in not being an idiot," she said. "Which is different." "True," he said. "But I'll take it." She almost smiled. The real one. The one he'd been seeing more of in the last month. It was not a fully arrived smile. It carried something behind it, the way her expressions often did now, the particular complexity of a woman who had been through enough to know that smiling didn't mean simple. But it was real. Ethan made a small sound in his sleep, a conversational sound, the kind that meant nothing except that he was present and dreaming. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian said. "Probably." "What are you doing next Saturday?" She looked at him, careful, measuring. "I don't have a plan," she said. "Ethan either?" "He's 3 months old. His calendar is open." "There's a park," he said, "near my building. It has a section that's apparently specifically designed for very small people and the caregivers of very small people. Benches, flat paths, trees that have probably made it through to actual green by next week." He paused. "I thought maybe we could walk, if you wanted." She looked at him for a moment. He held still in the way he'd learned to hold still, not pressing, not filling the silence with justifications, just letting her have the moment she needed to decide. "That's not complicated," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "That's the idea." She looked at Ethan, sleeping. At the room beyond the doorway where Keisha was handing a folder to the young couple and pointing at something on the wall, where the Garcia baby slept in the stroller with the same total trust that Ethan slept with, the innate confidence of the very young that whoever is there will remain. She looked at the space they were standing in, the junction of old foundation and new walls, the building that had been built on what was solid and changed what wasn't. "Okay," she said. One word. The same word she'd said in January, in the cold outside the groundbreaking, but weighted differently now. Heavier in the good way. The way something feels heavier when it has actual substance. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she confirmed. "Honk." The reception went on for another hour. Adrian moved through it the way he moved through events, talking to the right people, acknowledging the board members, spending time with Rosalind and the twins, which had become less awkward than it might have been because Rosalind was direct in the way people are when they've been through something that burned off their patience for indirection. She told him the foundation fund had changed her situation materially. She said it plainly, without inflation, and he received it the same way. He talked with Keisha about the intake process for the family integration space. She had 3 families already scheduled for the first week, which was more than he'd expected and which she said was less than she'd anticipated, because she'd already been telling people about it before the ribbon was cut. He talked to 2 of the journalists, briefly, about the construction timeline and the scope of the expansion. He gave them the numbers and the context. He didn't repeat the speech. It had been said. His mother found him near the end. Ready to go? She said. She had her coat on, her purse in her hand, the particular energy of a 71-year-old woman who has attended the event she came to attend and is not interested in the remainder of the canapes. Almost, he said. She looked at him with the look she'd been refining for 51 years. You look different, she said. Then what? Then October. She straightened his jacket collar, which he'd been enduring since childhood. You looked like a man carrying something in October, something heavy and slightly wrong-shaped. And now? She considered. Like a man who set it down and is figuring out what to do with his hands. He looked at her. That's a fair description. It usually is, she said, without false modesty. Come for dinner Sunday. Sunday, he said. She kissed his cheek and left, and he watched her go, and he thought about what it meant to be raised by someone who showed up, who made the choice not once but every day for 5 decades, who had carried a truth for 30 years trying to protect him from something she thought might damage him, and had finally understood that the protection was itself a kind of distance, and had sat down across a kitchen island and told him the truth instead. Growth was not a clean process. It didn't happen in revelations, mostly. It happened in kitchen islands and hospital corridors and waiting room chairs and phone calls at 9:15 at night. It happened in the decision to stay when leaving was available, in the choice to say the true thing when the prepared thing would have been easier, in the daily repetition of showing up and the slow accumulation of what that meant. He had been a man who built things and believed that the building was the point. He was becoming a man who understood that the building was the means, that the point was what you were building it for, and who you were when you were in it. He didn't have a clean resolution to offer himself. There wasn't a moment he could point to and say, there, that's when I became better. There was only the accumulation. October, November, December, January, February, March. A series of days in which he had tried, imperfectly and with significant backsliding, to see clearly and act accordingly. He was still trying. He expected to be still trying for a long time. That was all right. He had finally understood that still trying was not failure. Still trying was just what it looked like from the inside. On the Saturday after the opening, he was at the park by 10. He'd gotten there early, which was a habit, and had stood near the entrance for a while, feeling faintly ridiculous, and then had walked around the park once because standing still was harder than moving. The trees had made it to actual green, just barely, the tentative green of early spring, but real, the kind you could believe in. Claire arrived at 10:05, Ethan in the stroller now rather than the carrier because he was large enough now to make the carrier a different proposition, and she was wearing a jacket he recognized from the hospital, and her hair pulled back the efficient way, and she was a little out of breath. He decided this was a good moment to need a diaper change, she said. Twice. Standard negotiating tactic, Adrian said. She looked at him. Are you implying my 3-month-old is strategic? I'm suggesting he has timing, Adrian said. She considered this and then allowed, he does seem to wait for inconvenient moments. She released the stroller brake and they started along the path, the pace of it set by the stroller wheels on the slight irregularities of the path, which was a slower pace than Adrian typically walked, and which he did not adjust. They walked for a while without talking about anything in particular. She pointed out a dog that Ethan seemed to be tracking with focused interest. He mentioned that the park's old bandstand structure was going to need rework in the next few years, and she said that's a thing she never would have noticed before knowing him. He said he wasn't sure whether that was useful or annoying. She said probably both. Somewhere near the middle loop of the path, where the trees were oldest and thickest and the sound of the street fell away to almost nothing, she said, I've been thinking about what you said at the ceremony, about building on the original foundation. He waited. I'm not the same person I was in that marriage, she said. I want to be clear about that. Not as a warning, just as a fact. What I went through in the last 2 years changed me in ways I'm still finding. She kept walking, eyes on the path. I'm not saying that to close something. I'm saying it because I want to be honest about where I am, which is a thing I didn't do enough of before. I went along with things when I should have said, this isn't working, this specific thing, let's talk about it. She paused. I did some of that damage too. He had not expected her to say that. He said nothing because she wasn't asking him to respond. She was telling him something true. I'm not the person who needs what I needed at 34, she said. I need different things now. I'm more specific about what I'll accept, what I won't. She looked at him briefly, then away. And I have Ethan now, which means whatever I let into my life is something I have to be careful about. Not afraid, just careful. I understand, he said. Do you? Careful means you know what you're protecting, he said. That's not the same as closed. She was quiet for a moment. No, it's not. They walked on. Ethan had fallen asleep again. He seemed to operate on a strict cycle of intense alertness, followed by total unconsciousness, like a very small person managing a very full schedule. I need to say something, Adrian said, and I want to say it once and not use it as a lever, so I need you to hear it that way. She looked at him, waiting. I understand that I may have forfeited the right to what I want, he said, by what I did and didn't do during the marriage, by the story I told afterward. I understand that there might not be a path from where we were to somewhere new, and that's a consequence I have to be able to sit with. He kept walking, kept his voice level. But I want you to know what I want. Not as a demand, not as a proposal, just as the truth, which I should have been better at delivering earlier. He paused. I want to know you, the person you are now. I want to know Ethan. I want to earn the right to be in the room with both of you, not because of what we were before, but because of who I'm trying to become. He let it sit. That's it. That's the whole thing. She didn't answer right away. She walked and he walked beside her, and the park did what parks do, absorbed the silence and returned it slightly altered. Saturday walks, she said finally. He looked at her. As a start, she said, not a conclusion, not a promise of anything, just this. Saturdays. The park. We see how it goes. She looked at Ethan, sleeping. He's going to wake up and want to look at things, and I'm going to need both hands. And you're going to need to not be weird about helping, because I can't be managing your feelings about it while also managing him. I won't be weird about it, he said. You might be, she said. You've been known to overthink things. Fair, he said. Just pick him up if I hand him to you, she said. You don't have to make a whole thing of it. He looked at her. At Ethan. At the early spring park going on around them. Unhurried, the way life goes on around the particular moments that matter. Not pausing for them, not marking them with any special ceremony, just continuing as it does. Okay, he said. She nodded. They walked on. There are things people say about second chances that make them sound cleaner than they are, that they redeem the past, that they arrive as gifts, that they require the person receiving them to be transformed. What Adrian Blackwood had learned between October and March, between a gray sky arrival at a hospital lobby and an early spring walk with a stroller and 2 different socks worth of exhaustion and the very small ordinary weight of an infant handed over without ceremony. What he'd learned was that second chances don't look like second chances while you're in them. They look like Tuesdays. They look like a character reference letter sent without acknowledgement. They look like sitting in a waiting room chair because there's nowhere else to be and you're not going to be the kind of person who leaves anymore. He had not become a better man in a single revelation. He had become a better man in the accumulation of small decisions to be honest when dishonesty was available, to stay when leaving was easier, to say the true thing even when the prepared thing was right there. He was not finished becoming. He expected he wouldn't be. That was what growth actually looked like from the inside. Not arrival, not the clean closure of a lesson learned, but the ongoing effort of someone who has finally understood what the effort is actually for. Ethan woke up as they rounded the last loop of the path, coming back toward the park entrance. He woke up the way he did everything, suddenly, completely, with total commitment to being awake. He made a sound that communicated a range of needs with impressive efficiency for someone who had no words. Claire reached into the stroller with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times, which she had, and she picked him up, and he settled against her shoulder with the specific confidence of an infant who knows this particular shoulder as well as he knows anything, which is to say, completely. Then he looked at Adrian over her shoulder, the focused, opinion-forming look, and the smile again. The clear, uncomplicated, total smile of a face that has not yet learned the cost of giving things away freely. Adrian reached out, slowly, and put one hand on the back of Ethan's head, the way you'd do it without thinking if you'd been doing it long enough to not think about it. Light, just there. Ethan kept smiling. Claire felt it. The shift, the hand, the weight of the moment, and she didn't say anything. She just kept walking, and he walked beside her, and the park held them all in its early spring ordinary way, and the city went on around it, and the hospital stood at the edge of the neighborhood with its new East Pavilion and its old foundation, and Keisha in the integration room, and Patrice in the unit, and Rosalind's twins getting bigger every week. None of it was resolved the way stories are supposed to be resolved. Claire was still tired. Adrian was still learning. Ethan was still 3 months old and had not signed off on any of it, and would have opinions of his own to contribute in time. The future was not arranged. It was not guaranteed. But they were walking, together on a Saturday, in a park that had made it to green. That was the thing about foundations, the real ones, the ones that last. They don't announce themselves. You don't recognize them as foundations while you're living on them. You only understand what held you up after you've been through something that could have brought the whole structure down. And you're standing in the aftermath, still upright, a little more honest about what you're made of. Adrian Blackwood had walked into a hospital in October with a charcoal suit and a memorized schedule and an identity built on premises he'd never questioned. He walked out of the park on a March Saturday with someone else's baby's hand wrapped around his index finger, tight the way infants hold things, with no understanding of value or consequence, just the pure instinct toward warmth. He thought that was probably the whole lesson. He thought, this is what I was building toward, and I didn't know it, and now I do. He held on.